Welcome to the start of your journey toward earning the Professional in Human Resources certification. This course is designed to be a comprehensive guide to the complex landscape of the PHR exam, ensuring you're not just memorizing facts, but truly understanding the underlying mechanics of HR leadership. By choosing this program, you're making a deliberate investment in your professional standing, as the PHR credential serves as a rigorous validation of your technical and operational HR knowledge. We will navigate through every critical domain, from business strategy and workforce planning to total rewards and employee relations. Each module is structured to strip away the fluff and focus purely on the core competencies and legal frameworks that the HRCI expects you to master. You will learn how to align human resources initiatives with organizational goals, manage risk effectively, and navigate the intricacies of employment law. This is not just about passing a test. It is about adopting the mindset of a strategic partner who can influence the trajectory of an entire organization. The roadmap for this course follows a logical progression that mirrors the official exam content outline provided by the HRCI. We begin with strategy and business management to establish the big picture context, then move into talent planning and acquisition to cover how we staff those strategies. From there, we dive into learning and development to ensure organizational growth, followed by total rewards to understand the economics of the workforce. Our final major technical pillar is employee and labor relations, which addresses the human and legal elements of the workplace. Throughout these segments, you will encounter the technical knowledge required for the operational aspects of HR, as well as the professional behaviors necessary for ethical practice. We will conclude with a dedicated summary focused on the final exam environment and tactical tips for the day of the test. My goal is to ensure that by the time you reach that final summary, you feel equipped to handle any scenario the exam presents. I hope you find this course both challenging and rewarding as we work toward your certification. See you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. Strategy is often a misunderstood term in the business world, frequently confused with simple goal setting or tactical execution. At its core, business strategy is a coherent set of choices about how an organization will achieve its objectives by positioning itself uniquely in a competitive market. For a human resources professional, understanding these foundations is not merely an academic exercise, but a functional necessity. We must recognize that every HR activity, from hiring to compensation, is a downstream effect of the organization's high-level strategy. If the business intends to lead through innovation, the HR strategy will look fundamentally different than if the business intends to lead through cost leadership. You cannot effectively manage human capital if you do not understand the economic and operational logic that governs why the organization exists. Achieving a professional in human resources certification requires you to view the department not as a siloed support function, but as a strategic partner that enables the broader business engine. The strategic planning process typically begins with a rigorous environmental scan, often utilizing tools like SWOT or PESTLE analysis to understand internal strengths and external pressures. Once the landscape is understood, the leadership defines the mission and vision statements, which serve as the North Star for all subsequent decision-making. A mission statement describes the current purpose and reason for the organization's existence, answering the question of what the company does and for whom. Conversely, a vision statement is aspirational and forward-looking, outlining what the organization hopes to become in the future. As an HR professional, you must ensure that the talent management strategies you implement are congruent with these statements. If there is a disconnect between the company's stated mission and how it treats its employees, the organizational culture will suffer and strategic goals will remain unmet. Your role involves translating these high-level ideals into tangible competencies that you seek in new hires and reinforce in current employees. Sustainable competitive advantage is the holy grail of business strategy, and it is here that HR has its most significant impact. According to the resource-based view of the firm, An organization gains a competitive edge through resources that are valuable, rare, inimitable, and non-substitutable. While a competitor might be able to replicate a piece of software or a manufacturing process, they cannot easily replicate a highly engaged, specialized, and effectively managed workforce. This is known as causal ambiguity. It is difficult for outsiders to see exactly how the synergy of your people leads to your success. HR contributes to this by developing sophisticated systems for talent development and retention that are deeply embedded in the company's unique culture. When the human capital of a firm is aligned with its strategic goals, the resulting efficiency and innovation become extremely difficult for competitors to copy. This alignment is what transforms HR from a cost center into a primary driver of organizational value and long-term viability. The execution of strategy requires a disciplined approach to resource allocation, which includes time, money, and human effort. In a dynamic corporate marketplace, the ability to pivot or adapt the strategy is just as important as the initial planning phase. HR professionals facilitate this agility by creating flexible organizational structures and fostering a culture that embraces continuous improvement and learning. We must also be aware of the strategy structure culture triad, where the organizational structure and the behavioral norms must support the strategic direction. If the strategy calls for rapid expansion into new markets, but the internal structure is overly bureaucratic and slow, the strategy is likely to fail. Therefore, the HR practitioner acts as a bridge, ensuring that the human infrastructure is robust enough to carry the weight of the strategic objectives. Understanding these foundations allows you into the room where these high-level decisions are made, providing you with the context needed to manage the workforce effectively. See you in the next lecture. Hello. It is good to see you again as we continue our exploration of business strategy and management. When we discuss organizational structure, we are effectively discussing the architecture of authority and communication within a firm. A functional structure is perhaps the most traditional approach, where the organization is divided into specialized departments such as finance, marketing, and human resources. This model promotes a high degree of technical expertise because employees work alongside peers with similar skill sets, yet often create silos that inhibit cross-departmental collaboration. In a divisional structure, the organization is instead partitioned by product lines, geographic markets, or specific customer groups. While this decentralization allows for greater agility and responsiveness to local market needs, it frequently leads to a redundancy of resources, as each division may maintain its own independent support functions. Understanding how these structural choices dictate the flow of information is essential for any HR professional aiming to align workforce capabilities with overarching business objectives. The matrix structure represents a more complex attempt to balance functional expertise with project-based agility by requiring employees to report to two different managers simultaneously. For example, a software engineer might report to a functional head of engineering for professional development while reporting to a project manager for daily deliverables. This dual reporting line is designed to maximize resource utilization and foster flexibility, but it introduces significant potential for role ambiguity and power struggles between managers. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we find flat or horizontal hierarchies, which aim to minimize the distance between executive leadership and frontline staff. By removing middle management layers, these organizations empower employees to make decisions more quickly and take greater ownership of their work. However, as an organization grows, a flat structure can become difficult to maintain, as the lack of clear promotional pathways and formal oversight may lead to confusion regarding accountability. Organizational culture is the shared set of values, beliefs, and norms that govern how people behave within these structures. While structure defines the formal reporting lines, culture defines the informal expectations that dictate how work actually gets done. Edgar Schein's model of organizational culture provides a useful framework here, categorizing culture into three distinct levels: artifacts, espoused values, and underlying assumptions. Artifacts are the visible elements like office layout and dress code, while espoused values are the stated goals and philosophies of the leadership. The most difficult level to influence is the set of underlying assumptions, which are the unconscious, taken for granted beliefs that truly drive employee behavior. To maintain a positive workplace culture, HR must ensure that the artifacts and values seen on the surface are congruent with these deep-seated assumptions, as any disconnect will likely result in cynicism and disengagement among the staff. A strong culture serves as a strategic asset by aligning employee behavior with the company's long-term vision without the need for constant supervision. When culture is healthy, it drives productivity because employees understand exactly how their individual contributions support the collective mission. Conversely, a toxic culture can undermine even the most efficient organizational structure by fostering internal competition or ethical lapses. HR professionals are responsible for conducting cultural assessments through engagement surveys and turnover analysis to identify areas where the culture may deviate from the intended strategic path. Shaping culture is not a one-time initiative, but a continuous process of reinforcement through hiring practices, recognition programs, and leadership behavior. By deliberately managing the intersection of formal structure and informal culture, you create an environment where the organization can execute its strategy with minimal friction. I look forward to discussing our next topic with you in the upcoming session. Hello, it is good to see you back as we continue our exploration of strategy and business management. When we talk about HR metrics and data analysis, we are fundamentally discussing the translation of human behavior into the language of the boardroom, which is numbers. For a professional pursuing the PHR certification, it is not enough to simply understand people. You must understand the quantitative evidence of how people impact the organization's bottom line. Metrics serve as the instrumentation of your HR strategy, allowing you to observe the health of the system without relying on intuition or anecdotal evidence. Data-driven decision-making provides a level of objectivity that is required when communicating with executive leadership who prioritize fiscal responsibility and strategic alignment. We begin this process by identifying key performance indicators, or KPIs, which are the specific metrics that demonstrate how effectively a company is achieving its key business objectives. If you cannot measure a process, you cannot manage it, and you certainly cannot improve it in a way that is verifiable to stakeholders. One of the most foundational metrics you will encounter is the turnover rate, which measures the rate at which employees leave an organization and are replaced. To calculate this, you generally take the number of separations during a specific period and divide it by the average number of employees during that same period, then multiply by 100 to get a percentage. However, raw turnover numbers are often insufficient for deep analysis, so we must distinguish between voluntary and involuntary turnover. Voluntary turnover might signal issues with culture or compensation, whereas involuntary turnover reflects the company's efforts to remove underperformers. High turnover is not just a cultural problem. It is a significant financial drain due to the loss of institutional knowledge and the high cost of finding replacements. Understanding the nuances of these figures allows an HR professional to pinpoint exactly where the organizational leak is occurring and develop targeted interventions. Cost per hire is another critical metric that quantifies the total financial investment required to attract and occupy a vacant position with a new employee. This calculation must include both internal costs, such as the salary of the recruiting team and employee referral bonuses, and external costs like third-party agency fees and advertising expenses. To find the cost per hire, you sum these total recruiting costs and divide them by the total number of hires in a given period. This metric allows the HR department to evaluate the efficiency of their recruitment funnel and justify budget requests for various sourcing channels. It is important to remember that a low cost per hire is not always the goal if it results in poor quality hires who exit the company quickly. You must balance the cost of acquisition with the long-term value the employee brings to the organization to truly understand the efficiency of your talent acquisition strategy. Return on investment, or ROI, is perhaps the most persuasive metric in an HR professional's arsenal when presenting to the C-suite. In the context of HR initiatives, ROI measures the monetary value generated by a program compared to the cost of implementing that program. The formula is the total benefit minus the total cost, divided by the total cost, and then expressed as a percentage. For example, if a new safety training program costs $50,000 but leads to a reduction in workplace accidents that saves the company $100,000, the ROI is 100%. Calculating ROI forces HR to move away from soft benefits and toward hard financial outcomes that demonstrate how HR acts as a profit center rather than a cost center. This analytical rigor is what elevates HR from an administrative function to a strategic partner that contributes to the long-term viability of the enterprise. Data analysis in HR also involves identifying trends and correlations that might not be immediately obvious through simple observation. Descriptive analytics tell us what happened in the past, such as how many people left last year, while predictive analytics attempt to tell us what might happen in the future based on historical patterns. As a PHR candidate, you should be comfortable looking at a data set and asking why a certain metric is moving in a specific direction. For instance, if you notice that cost per hire is decreasing while turnover is increasing, you might conclude that the quality of hire is being sacrificed for the sake of speed or budget. This ability to synthesize multiple data points into a coherent narrative is what allows you to make informed recommendations that align with a broader business strategy. Mastering these quantitative skills ensures that your HR department operates with the same precision as finance or engineering. I look forward to discussing the legislative and regulatory environment with you in the next lesson. Welcome back. We are now turning our attention to the legislative and regulatory framework that governs human resources within the United States. Navigating the legal landscape is not merely a specialized task for attorneys. It is a fundamental competency for every HR professional seeking PHR certification. At its core, the regulatory environment is a collection of constraints and requirements imposed by federal, state, and local governments to ensure fair treatment of the workforce. When we discuss federal statutes, we're looking at the baseline requirements that apply across state lines, though you must always remember that state laws can be more restrictive. Understanding the hierarchy of authority is essential because when a conflict arises between federal and state mandates, the professional must typically adhere to the standard that provides the greatest protection to the employee. This lesson focuses on the federal level, where the most significant liability often resides for a business. By internalizing these rules, you shift from a reactive posture to a proactive one, where you can design policies that prevent litigation before it starts. The legislative process begins with the introduction of a bill in Congress, which, upon passing both chambers and being signed by the president, becomes an act or a statute. However, the statute itself is often broad in its language, leaving the implementation details to administrative agencies such as the Department of Labor or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. These agencies issue regulations which carry the force of law and provide the specific guidance needed for daily HR operations. It is important to distinguish between a statute, which is the law passed by the legislature, and an administrative regulation, which is the interpretation of that law by an agency. Furthermore, we must consider the role of the judiciary, as court decisions, case law, often clarify how these statutes and regulations should be applied in specific scenarios. Failure to stay current with these evolving interpretations can lead to significant financial and reputational damage to an organization. Compliance is the act of aligning organizational practices with these legal requirements, but it also involves a systematic approach to risk management. As an HR practitioner, your role includes auditing internal policies to ensure they do not inadvertently violate statutes, such as the Fair Labor Standards Act or the Family and Medical Leave Act. You must consider both transparency and record keeping, as many federal laws mandate specific documentation that must be retained for a set number of years. For instance, if an agency conducts an audit, the burden of proof often rests on the employer to demonstrate that their actions were non-discriminatory and legally sound. This requires a disciplined approach to data management and a deep understanding of which laws apply based on the size of your organization. Some laws apply to all employers, while others only affect those with 15, 20, or 50 employees. Minimizing legal liability requires a nuanced understanding of protected classes and the different types of discrimination, such as disparate treatment and adverse impact. Disparate treatment occurs when an employer intentionally treats an employee differently based on a protected characteristic, while adverse impact is often more subtle, occurring when a seemingly neutral policy disproportionately affects a protected group. You should be prepared to evaluate your company's selection procedures and performance management systems for these potential pitfalls. Beyond discrimination, the regulatory environment also encompasses workplace safety and the rights of employees to engage in concerted activities. Building a culture of compliance means training managers to recognize these legal boundaries in their daily interactions with subordinates. It is not enough to have a handbook. The policies within that handbook must be consistently applied and regularly reviewed against the latest legislative updates. Staying updated on ever-changing employment regulations is a continuous process that requires a reliable system for information gathering. The legislative environment is not static. New laws are passed, and existing ones are amended or reinterpreted by the courts and successive presidential administrations. Using government resources, such as the Federal Register, can provide early warnings of proposed rule changes that might impact your business strategy. You should also consider the impact of executive orders, which can change the requirements for federal contractors without the need for new legislation. By maintaining a sharp focus on these regulatory shifts, you ensure that your organization remains a stable and law-abiding entity. This specialized knowledge allows the HR professional to serve as a strategic advisor to executive leadership, quantifying the risks associated with various business decisions. I look forward to discussing how these regulations impact ethics and corporate responsibility in our next session. Hello again. In this session, we will examine the intersection of ethics and corporate responsibility within the context of human resource management according to the PHR body of knowledge. Ethical leadership serves as the foundational architecture upon which a sustainable human resources department is built. When we discuss ethics in a professional setting, we are essentially talking about the codified values that govern decision-making processes. For an HR professional, this translates into maintaining a high degree of integrity and transparency, even when these values appear to conflict with short-term business objectives. Ethical leadership requires that you act as a moral compass for the organization, ensuring that policies are not only legal, but also fair and equitable. If an organization lacks this ethical core, trust erodes between the employees and the management, leading to significant turnover and decreased productivity. Therefore, you must be prepared to advocate for ethical standards at the highest levels of corporate strategy. Corporate social responsibility, or CSR, extends the concept of ethics beyond the internal walls of the office and into the broader community. It is a business model where a company holds itself accountable to its stakeholders, including the public and the environment. As an HR practitioner, you are often the primary driver of CSR initiatives, as these programs frequently involve employee volunteerism, sustainability efforts, and philanthropic alignment. CSR is not merely a marketing exercise. It is a strategic approach to long-term viability that can enhance a company's public reputation and brand value. When a company demonstrates a genuine commitment to social responsibility, it often finds it easier to attract and retain top-tier talent who share those same values. This alignment between corporate action and societal benefit creates a virtuous cycle that strengthens the organization's market position. Developing an effective code of conduct is a technical task that requires a deep understanding of both organizational culture and regulatory requirements. This document must go beyond simple "thou shalt not" statements and instead provide a positive framework for professional behavior. It should define the organization's core values and explain how those values apply to specific situations, such as conflicts of interest or the handling of proprietary information. Once the code is written, the HR department is responsible for its enforcement, which requires a consistent and unbiased approach to disciplinary actions. Enforcement must be visible and predictable. If employees perceive that the code only applies to some, its legitimacy is lost. Effective training on the code of conduct ensures that every member of the organization understands their responsibilities and the consequences of deviating from established ethical norms. Navigating moral dilemmas in the workplace is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of the HR role. These dilemmas often arise when there is a tension between protecting employee rights and safeguarding the company's financial interests or public image. For example, you may encounter a situation where a high-performing executive is accused of a policy violation that, if made public, could damage the company's stock price. In such cases, the ethical path is to conduct a thorough and objective investigation, prioritizing the integrity of the process over the immediate reputation of the brand. By adhering to a rigorous ethical framework, you protect the organization from long-term legal liability and cultural rot. Maintaining this balance requires a firm grasp of procedural justice and a willingness to make difficult decisions that favor systemic health over temporary convenience. Protecting the rights of employees is a fundamental ethical duty that also serves as a risk mitigation strategy. This involves ensuring a safe working environment, preventing harassment, and upholding the right to privacy and fair compensation. When HR fails to protect these rights, the organization is exposed to regulatory fines, lawsuits, and a toxic culture that can take years to repair. Beyond the legalities, there is a moral imperative to treat employees as ends in themselves rather than as mere instruments for profit. This perspective shift is crucial for developing a culture of mutual respect and high engagement. By championing employee rights, you build a resilient workforce that is more likely to be loyal and motivated. Ultimately, an ethical approach to human resources is not just about doing what is right. It is about building a better, more stable business. I'll see you in the next session. Hello. It is good to have you back as we continue our exploration of strategy and business management. Enterprise risk management, or ERM, represents a holistic shift in how an organization identifies and prepares for potential threats to its objectives. In the past, many HR professionals viewed risk strictly through the lens of workplace safety or workers' compensation claims, but the PHR exam requires a much broader perspective. Modern ERM views risk as any uncertainty that could impact the organization's ability to create value, ranging from financial volatility and legal liability to operational disruptions and reputational damage. As an HR professional, you are not merely a bystander in this process. You are a key architect of the human capital side of the risk register. You must understand that risk is not always something to be avoided, but rather something to be managed, measured, and sometimes strategically accepted to achieve business goals. This requires a systematic approach to identifying vulnerabilities before they manifest into crises that could jeopardize the entire enterprise. The foundation of any robust framework is a thorough risk assessment, which involves identifying, analyzing, and prioritizing potential hazards. You should start by categorizing risks into internal and external buckets to ensure no stone is left unturned. Internal risks might include things like high turnover in critical roles, data breaches due to poor employee training, or systemic compliance failures in payroll. External risks often involve shifts in the regulatory landscape, economic downturns, or even pandemic-related disruptions that affect your labor supply. Once identified, you evaluate these risks based on two primary dimensions: the likelihood of the event occurring and the potential impact it would have on the organization. This allows you to create a risk matrix, helping leadership visualize which threats require immediate investment and which are manageable with existing controls. For example, a high-impact, high-probability risk, like a sudden change in labor law, requires a much more proactive stance than a low-impact, low-probability administrative error. Once you have mapped out your risks, you must decide on an appropriate mitigation strategy for each, generally categorized into four responses: avoidance, reduction, sharing, or acceptance. Risk avoidance involves changing plans to eliminate the threat entirely, such as deciding not to expand into a high-risk international market. Risk reduction, which is perhaps where HR spends most of its time, involves implementing controls to minimize the severity or likelihood of a loss. An example here would be rigorous safety training or implementing multi-factor authentication to protect sensitive employee records from cyber threats. Risk sharing, often referred to as risk transfer, usually involves purchasing insurance policies or using third-party outsourcing to shift the financial burden of the risk to another entity. Finally, risk acceptance is a conscious decision to acknowledge the risk but take no action because the cost of mitigation outweighs the potential loss, which is a common approach for minor operational hiccups. A critical component of that often falls under the HR umbrella is the development of a comprehensive business continuity plan. While risk assessment aims to prevent issues, business continuity planning addresses what happens when prevention fails and a crisis actually occurs. Your goal is to ensure that the organization's most vital functions can continue during and after a disaster, such as a natural catastrophe, a massive technological failure, or a sudden loss of key personnel. HR's role in this is pivotal because you are responsible for the people element of the recovery, which include determining who is essential to operations and how they will be communicated with. You must establish protocols for emergency notification systems, remote work arrangements, and the preservation of vital records like payroll and benefits data. Without a clear plan for your workforce, even the most sophisticated financial or technical recovery efforts will likely falter because the human infrastructure is missing. Finally, we must address the HR professional's role in preventing massive compliance failures, which can lead to significant legal and financial penalties. Compliance risk is often systemic, meaning a single flaw in a hiring process or a misclassification of employees can result in a class action lawsuit or a government audit. To safeguard the organization, you must implement regular internal audits of your HR practices to ensure they align with both federal and local regulations. This includes reviewing Form I-9 compliance, ensuring non-exempt employees are being paid overtime correctly, and verifying that your anti-harassment policies are being actively enforced. By maintaining a proactive stance on compliance, you transform HR from a cost center that merely reacts to legal threats into a strategic partner that protects the organization's bottom line. Effective risk management ensures that the organization remains resilient, compliant, and prepared for the inherent uncertainties of the modern business environment. I hope this provides a clear framework for how you should approach risk at the enterprise level. I look forward to seeing you in the next session. Hello, and welcome back. Workforce planning serves as the bridge between an organization's strategic objectives and its actual human capacity to execute those goals. It is a systematic process where we attempt to quantify future labor requirements, and reconcile them with the current and projected labor availability. Without a formal planning strategy, an organization risks either being understaffed, which leads to burnout and missed revenue, or being overstaffed, which unnecessarily inflates labor costs. Effective planning requires a deep understanding of organizational goals and the external environment to ensure that the talent pipeline is robust. This is not a one-time event, but rather a continuous cycle of assessment and adjustment. We focus on identifying the specific skills, experiences, and headcount needed to move the business forward over a specific time horizon. By looking at historical data and future projections, HR professionals can transform the recruitment function from a reactive one to a proactive strategic partner. The first operational step in this process is forecasting labor demand, which involves estimating the quantity and quality of people needed to meet future objectives. This is often driven by external factors like market trends and internal factors like production goals or budget constraints. We use both quantitative methods, such as trend analysis or ratio analysis, and qualitative methods, such as the Delphi technique, to arrive at these estimates. Trend analysis allows us to look at past employment levels to predict future needs, assuming that historical patterns will continue. Ratio analysis helps us correlate staffing levels with specific business metrics, such as sales volume or production units. Qualitative methods are equally valuable because they capture the nuances of expert judgment and management intuition. By combining these approaches, we build a comprehensive view of what the organization will look like in the coming years. Once we understand the demand, we must turn our attention toward forecasting the internal and external labor supply. Internal supply analysis involves auditing our current workforce to understand their existing skills, potential for promotion, and likelihood of leaving the organization. We often use tools like replacement charts and succession plans to visualize who is ready to step into critical roles should a vacancy occur. It is also important to account for factors like turnover rates, internal transfers, and retirements, which naturally deplete the current talent pool. Simultaneously, we must look at the external labor market to gauge the availability of talent for hire. This includes monitoring unemployment rates, graduation rates in relevant fields, and the activities of competitors in the local or global market. If the external supply for a certain skill set is low, our strategy must shift toward internal development or more aggressive sourcing. The intersection of demand and supply forecasting reveals the talent gap, which is the discrepancy between what we have and what we need. When demand exceeds supply, a labor shortage exists, requiring us to implement strategies like overtime, contractor hiring, or increased recruitment efforts. Conversely, if supply exceeds demand, a labor surplus exists, which might necessitate hiring freezes, early retirement incentives, or reductions in force. Identifying these gaps early allows HR to develop actionable plans that are more sustainable than emergency hiring measures. These plans should address not only the headcount, but also the core competencies required for future success. We must also consider the timeline for these gaps. A short-term deficiency might be solved by temporary staff, while a long-term shift in the industry might require a complete overhaul of the training and development strategy. Developing an actionable workforce plan requires aligning these human resources strategies with the overall budget and business timeline. The final plan should outline specific activities such as targeted recruiting for niche skills, cross-training existing employees to increase flexibility, and implementing retention programs to protect existing talent. We must also establish metrics to measure the effectiveness of our planning, such as time to fill for critical roles or the turnover rate of high-potential employees. It is vital to communicate these plans to senior leadership to ensure that the necessary capital is allocated for these initiatives. A plan that is not backed by financial resources and executive buy-in is merely a theoretical exercise. By maintaining a disciplined approach to workforce planning, the HR function ensures that the organization remains agile and prepared for whatever changes the market may bring. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. We are now going to examine the mechanics of job analysis and design. Job analysis is the systematic process of gathering and documenting information about the work performed in an organization. You should view it as a diagnostic tool rather than a creative exercise. To perform a valid job analysis, you must examine the tasks, duties, and responsibilities that constitute a role, along with the environment in which the work occurs. This process identifies exactly what a worker does, how they do it, and why the work is necessary for the organizational objectives. In the context of the PHR exam, you need to understand that job analysis serves as the technical foundation for almost every other HR function. Without a reliable analysis, your recruitment efforts lack criteria, your compensation structures lack equity, and your performance appraisals lack objective standards. Data for this process is typically collected through various methods, such as interviews with subject matter experts, direct observation of the worker, or structured questionnaires like the position analysis questionnaire. Your goal is to produce a granular view of the job that remains objective and independent of the specific person currently occupying the role. The primary outputs of the job analysis process are the job description and the job specification. While these terms are often used interchangeably in casual conversation, they represent distinct components of the job documentation. The job description focuses on the job itself, outlining the primary duties, reporting relationships, and physical working conditions. It acts as a summary of the what and the how of the position. Conversely, the job specification shifts the focus to the person performing the job. It details the knowledge, skills, and abilities, often referred to as KSAs, that a candidate must possess to perform the work successfully. This includes educational requirements, specific certifications, and any particular cognitive or physical traits necessary for the role. For the purpose of the exam, remember that the job description describes the work, while the job specification describes the ideal worker. Keeping these two concepts separate is fundamental to building a legally defensible selection process. When you translate job analysis data into these documents, you must remain cognizant of the legal implications, particularly regarding the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA requires that an employer distinguish between essential functions and marginal functions of a job. An essential function is a fundamental duty of the position that the individual must be able to perform with or without reasonable accommodation. To determine if a function is essential, you might consider the frequency of the task, the amount of time spent on it, or the consequences of not requiring the employee to perform it. For instance, if a job exists specifically to perform a certain function, that function is undeniably essential. Marginal functions are those that are incidental or could be reassigned to another employee without altering the nature of the job. Drafting job descriptions that clearly identify these essential functions provides your organization with a vital layer of legal protection. It ensures that your hiring decisions are based on the candidate's ability to perform the core requirements of the role rather than arbitrary criteria. Beyond documentation, we must also consider job design, which involves defining how tasks are organized and combined to create a cohesive role. Effective job design seeks to improve organizational efficiency while simultaneously enhancing employee motivation and engagement. One common approach is job enlargement, which increases the scope of a job by adding more tasks at the same level of difficulty. While this can reduce the monotony of repetitive work, it does not necessarily increase the depth or complexity of the role. A more impactful strategy is job enrichment, which involves adding higher-level responsibilities, such as planning, organizing, and controlling one's own work. This aligns with Herzberg's two-factor theory by providing motivators like autonomy and achievement. Another iteration is job rotation, where employees move between different jobs to gain a broader understanding of the business and reduce physical or mental strain. You should evaluate these design choices based on the specific needs of the workflow and the desired outcomes for employee performance. Modern job design also encompasses flexible work arrangements, which have become a significant component of the contemporary employment relationship. Telecommuting, compressed work weeks, and flex time are all methods of designing a job to better fit the operational needs of the organization and the life requirements of the workforce. When you move toward these models, the job analysis must adapt to reflect how work is measured and managed when direct supervision is not possible. For the exam, you should understand that job design is not a static event, but an ongoing adjustment to technological changes and labor market trends. It requires a balance between the technical requirements of the task and the human needs of the worker. A failure in job design often manifests as high turnover, low productivity, or increased workplace accidents. By systematically applying the principles of job analysis, you ensure that the roles you create are both productive for the company and sustainable for the employee. That is all for this session. See you in the next lecture. Hello. It is good to have you back as we continue our exploration of talent planning and acquisition. Effective sourcing begins with the understanding that recruitment is not a reactive event, but a continuous strategic process. When we talk about sourcing, we are identifying the specific channels through which we find potential candidates, ranging from active job seekers to passive talent who may not be looking but possess the skills we need. A robust strategy balances various channels to ensure a steady flow of applicants. Job boards remaining a staple of the industry, yet their effectiveness often depends on how specialized or broad the platform is in relation to the role. Social media has matured into a sophisticated sourcing tool, allowing practitioners to leverage professional networks like LinkedIn or even industry-specific forums to find niche expertise. Employee referral programs often yield the highest quality of hire because current staff act as a first-line filter for cultural alignment. University partnerships offer a long-term play, establishing a pipeline of early career talent that can be developed within the organization's specific ecosystem. One of the most powerful, albeit less tangible, tools in your sourcing arsenal is the employer brand. An employer brand is the market's perception of what it is like to work at your organization, and it functions as a magnet for high-quality candidates. If your brand is strong and authentic, you spend less effort chasing candidates because they are already predisposed to wanting an association with your company. This brand is not just a marketing slogan. It is the sum of your organizational culture, values, and the actual experience of your employees. When candidates research your firm, they look for consistency between what you say and what they observe on review sites or through their own networking. A well-defined employer value proposition, or EVP, clearly communicates the unique benefits and experiences an employee receives in exchange for their skills and productivity. By managing this brand proactively, you reduce the cost per hire and increase the overall quality of the applicant pool before you even post a job. Building a robust talent pipeline is the operational goal of proactive sourcing and branding. Instead of starting from zero every time a requisition is opened, a pipeline approach ensures you have a pre-vetted pool of candidates ready for consideration. This requires staying in touch with silver medalists who were qualified but not selected for previous roles, as well as maintaining relationships with passive candidates through regular engagement. Sourcing is also about data. You must track which channels produce the best hires to allocate your recruiting budget effectively. If university recruiting yields high retention employees while expensive job boards yield high turnover, the data should dictate a shift in strategy. Diversity must be intentionally built into these sourcing channels by seeking out professional groups and platforms that cater to underrepresented populations. Ultimately, sourcing is the top of the funnel, and the breadth and quality of that funnel determine the success of every subsequent step in the hiring process. I look forward to seeing you in the next session. Welcome back. We are moving into the mechanics of decision-making within the hiring process. Selecting the right candidate is a repeatable process that must rely on objective data rather than intuition or subjective preference. When we talk about candidate selection methods, we are essentially discussing the predictive validity of various instruments used to forecast a candidate's future job performance. A selection process that lacks structure is often no better than a coin toss because it allows unconscious bias to fill the gaps where empirical data should be. To build a robust selection pipeline, we need to understand the distinction between reliability, which is the consistency of a measurement, and validity, which is how well the method measures what it is intended to measure. We start by ensuring that every assessment we use is tied directly to the job analysis we performed in previous stages. If an assessment does not correlate with the specific requirements of the role, it generates noise rather than actionable signal. By standardizing these methods, we ensure that every candidate is evaluated against the same criteria, which is the only way to make a fair and effective comparison. Structured interviews are among the most effective tools we have, provided they are implemented with rigor. Unlike unstructured interviews, where the conversation might drift based on the interviewer's rapport with the candidate, a structured interview uses a fixed set of questions for every applicant. These questions are usually behavioral or situational, asking the candidate to describe a past experience or how they would handle a hypothetical challenge. By using a predetermined scoring rubric, often called a behaviorally anchored rating scale, we can quantify qualitative answers and reduce the influence of the halo effect or similarity bias. This consistency allows us to compare candidates on an apple-to-apples basis, making the final decision much more defensible. It is not enough to simply ask everyone the same questions. The interviewers must also be trained to interpret the answers through the lens of the established rubric. Without this layer of discipline, the interview remains a subjective exercise masquerading as an objective assessment. Cognitive ability tests represent another category of selection tools that often boast high predictive validity for a wide range of jobs. These tests measure an individual's capacity for logic, reasoning, problem-solving, and verbal or numerical comprehension. In many technical or complex managerial roles, the ability to process new information and adapt to changing environments is a primary driver of success. However, while these tests provide strong data points, HR professionals must be mindful of disparate impact, where certain groups might score lower due to factors unrelated to job performance. This is why a multi-measure approach is superior to relying on a single test score. We use these assessments to narrow the field or to verify the competencies suggested by the resume, but we must always ensure the test is a business necessity. If the test cannot be directly linked to the tasks outlined in the job description, it becomes a liability rather than an asset. Personality assessments and integrity tests offer a different perspective by focusing on behavioral traits and workplace tendencies. These instruments, such as those based on the five-factor model, help us understand how a candidate might fit within the existing organizational culture or team dynamic. While personality is not always a direct predictor of task performance, it is a significant predictor of contextual performance, such as teamwork and organizational citizenship. Integrity tests, specifically, are designed to identify the risk of counterproductive work behaviors like theft or absenteeism. It is important to distinguish between overt integrity tests, which ask direct questions about attitudes toward dishonesty, and personality-oriented tests that infer integrity from general traits. As with any psychometric tool, these should be used as one component of a broader selection matrix. The goal is to build a composite view of the candidate that balances technical skill, cognitive capacity, and behavioral alignment. The final stage of the selection process often involves work sample tests or simulations, which provide the most direct evidence of a candidate's ability. By asking a candidate to perform a task that mirrors the actual work they will do, we minimize the gap between what they say they can do and what they actually can do. For example, a candidate for a coding role might complete a programming exercise, while an administrative candidate might be asked to organize a complex schedule. These methods typically have the highest predictive validity because they're the most job-related. When combined with structured interviews and cognitive testing, work samples create a comprehensive validation strategy. We must ensure that the work sample is administered under the same conditions for everyone to maintain the integrity of the data. Successful selection is not about finding the person we like the most, but about using these various lenses to identify who is statistically most likely to succeed. I hope this gives you a clearer view of how to structure your selection process. See you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. When we design recruitment processes, we aren't just looking for talent. We are navigating a complex landscape of statutory requirements. In the United States, the cornerstone of this landscape is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. As an HR professional preparing for the PHR exam, you must recognize that legal compliance starts long before a candidate walks into an interview room. It begins with how you draft job descriptions and where you choose to post your advertisements. If your sourcing methods systematically exclude protected groups, you may face claims of disparate impact, even if you had no explicit intent to discriminate. You need to ensure that every requirement listed for a role is job-related and consistent with business necessity. This means that if you require a college degree or a specific physical capability, you must be able to demonstrate that such a requirement is essential for performing the job's core functions. The Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures provide a framework for determining whether your hiring practices are legally defensible. One of the most critical metrics you will encounter is the 4/5 rule, which is a rule of thumb used to determine if an adverse impact exists. Broadly speaking, if the selection rate for any protected group is less than 80% of the selection rate for the group with the highest rate, the protocol is considered to have an adverse impact. It is important to remember that failing this statistical test does not automatically mean you have broken the law, but it does shift the burden of proof to the employer. You must then prove that the selection procedure is valid, meaning it actually measures what it claims to measure, and that no less discriminatory alternative exists. For the exam, you should focus on the concept of validity, particularly content validity and criterion-related validity, as these are your primary defenses in a legal challenge. Background checks and credit reports introduce another layer of regulatory oversight, primarily through the Fair Credit Reporting Act, or FCRA. While it is often necessary to verify a candidate's history, you cannot simply run a credit check or a criminal background search without following specific procedural steps. Before you even request a report from a third-party consumer reporting agency, you must provide the candidate with a clear, standalone written disclosure and obtain their written authorization. If the information in that report leads you to consider an adverse action, such as rescinding a job offer, you're legally obligated to follow a two-step notification process. First, you must issue a pre-adverse action notice, which includes a copy of the report and a summary of the candidate's rights under the FCRA. This gives the individual a chance to dispute inaccuracies before you make a final decision, after which you must issue the formal adverse action notice if you proceed with the rejection. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act, or ADEA, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, further constrain how you interact with applicants during the selection phase. The ADEA specifically protects individuals who are 40 years of age or older, making it illegal to use recruitment language that targets recent grads or digital natives, if such language discourages older workers from applying. Regarding the ADEA, your primary responsibility during hiring is to avoid prohibited inquiries into a candidate's medical history or disability status before a conditional offer of employment is made. You can ask if a candidate can perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation, but you cannot ask about the nature or severity of a disability. If a candidate requests an accommodation for the application process itself, such as a screen reader for a digital assessment, you are generally required to provide it unless it causes an undue hardship to the organization. Finally, you must be aware of the legal implications of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which requires employers to verify the identity and employment authorization of all new hires. This is handled through the Form I-9 process, which must be completed within 3 business days of the hire date. While you must ensure that every employee is legally authorized to work in the country, you must be careful not to overcorrect and commit document abuse by demanding specific documents or more documents than are legally required. Discrimination based on citizenship status or national origin is strictly prohibited, and the I-9 process must be applied uniformly to all individuals regardless of their appearance or accent. By maintaining a standardized, objective, and well-documented hiring process, you minimize the risk of subjective bias and create a defensible record of why specific hiring decisions were made. Consistency is your best defense against litigation, as it demonstrates that all candidates were subjected to the same rigorous and fair criteria. I hope this provides a clear framework for understanding the legal constraints on hiring. Until next time, welcome back. In this session, we are going to examine the critical transition from candidate to productive employee by distinguishing between orientation and onboarding. Orientation is a discrete, transactional event that typically occurs within the first few days of employment. It is characterized by administrative necessity, where the primary objective is to finalize the legal and logistical framework of the employment relationship. During orientation, a new hire focuses on completing mandatory paperwork, receiving identification badges, and reviewing the employee handbook. This phase is often centralized and standardized, ensuring that every individual understands the basic rules of the workplace, such as safety protocols and attendance policies. While these tasks are indispensable for compliance, they do not facilitate long-term integration into the social or professional fabric of the organization. Orientation is about providing the tools for the first day, but it rarely addresses the skills needed for the first year. It is a necessary foundation, yet it remains insufficient if your goal is sustained employee retention. Onboarding, by contrast, is a strategic, longitudinal process that can span several months or even a full year. It represents a comprehensive approach to integrating a new employee into the specific social and performance-based aspects of their role. If orientation is about the what, then onboarding is about the how and why. The process begins the moment an offer is accepted and continues well past the initial training phase. A well-designed onboarding program focuses on 3 distinct pillars: operational, social, and strategic integration. Operational integration ensures the employee has the specific technical knowledge required for their job. Social integration involves building relationships with peers and mentors to foster a sense of belonging. Strategic integration aligns the individual's personal goals with the broader mission and culture of the organization. One of the primary quantitative objectives of professional onboarding is the acceleration of time to productivity. Organizations often suffer from a productivity gap, where new hires consume more resources than they produce during their initial months. By structuring the transfer of knowledge through deliberate milestones, HR professionals can shorten the learning curve significantly. This involves setting clear performance expectations at the 30, 60, and 90-day marks. When a new hire understands exactly what success looks like in their specific context, they're less likely to experience the ambiguity that leads to frustration. Furthermore, onboarding facilitates cultural assimilation by exposing the employee to the unwritten rules and values of the firm. This alignment reduces the cognitive load on the employee, allowing them to focus their energy on task execution rather than navigating social uncertainty. The impact of onboarding on retention rates is a significant factor in human resource strategy. Statistics consistently show that a significant percentage of employee turnover occurs within the first 6 months of tenure. This early attrition is frequently a result of buyer's remorse, where the reality of the workplace fails to meet the expectations set during the recruitment phase. A robust onboarding program acts as a bridge that maintains the momentum of the hiring process. By providing a mentor or buddy, the organization creates an immediate feedback loop for the new hire. This intervention allows the company to identify and resolve concerns before they escalate into a decision to resign. Investing in a comprehensive onboarding experience is essentially a risk mitigation strategy designed to protect the initial investment made during sourcing and selection. Designing these experiences requires a shift from viewing HR as an administrative function to viewing it as a strategic partner. You must ensure that the transition from the talent acquisition team to the direct manager is seamless. Often, onboarding fails because the handoff is poorly defined, leaving the new hire in a state of professional limbo. To prevent this, HR should provide managers with structured kits that include checklists, departmental goals, and specific socialization plans. Consistency is paramount across different departments to ensure equitable treatment of all new hires. When onboarding is treated as a continuous process rather than a one-time checklist, the organization builds a resilient workforce. This strategic approach transforms a mere job into a career path, benefiting both the individual and the enterprise. I hope this helps clarify how we move beyond simple paperwork to true employee integration. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this session, we are going to examine the underlying mechanics of how adults acquire knowledge, as this forms the basis for any effective learning and development strategy within an organization. To understand adult learning, we must first distinguish it from pedagogy, which is the study of how children learn. Malcolm Knowles popularized the term andragogy to describe the specific art and science of helping adults learn, moving away from the teacher-centric model toward one that is learner-centric. Knowles identified several core assumptions about adult learners, the first being the concept of self-concept. As people mature, their self-concept moves from one of being a dependent personality toward one of being a self-directed human being who desires autonomy in their educational pursuits. If you design a training program that treats adults like passive recipients of information, you will likely encounter resistance or disengagement. Instead, HR professionals should create environments where the learner has a say in the process and feels a sense of ownership over their professional development. This shift in perspective is fundamental to passing the PHR exam, as many questions will hinge on your ability to recognize that adults require respect and a degree of control over their learning environment. The second pillar of andragogy is the role of experience, which serves as a rich resource for learning. Unlike children, who are essentially blank slates in a formal classroom setting, adults come to the workplace with decades of varied experiences, biases, and mental models. These pre-existing cognitive structures act as a filter through which all new information must pass. Effective training design leverages this by incorporating discussions, problem-solving activities, and case studies that allow participants to draw on what they already know. However, these experiences can also lead to rigidity or a resistance to change if the new information contradicts established habits. Your role in HR is to facilitate a process where learners can examine their prior experiences and integrate them with new concepts. When you ignore an adult's background, you invalidate a significant part of their identity, which serves as a major barrier to the retention of new skills or knowledge. A third critical assumption involves the readiness to learn and the orientation to learning. Adults typically become ready to learn something when they perceive a need to know it in order to cope effectively with real-life situations or tasks. This is closely tied to their orientation to learning, which is task-centered or problem-centered rather than subject-centered. While a child might learn algebra simply because it is on the curriculum, an adult seeks out knowledge that offers immediate application to their current job performance or future career progression. This means that for a training program to be successful, the why must be clearly established at the outset. If the learner does not see the immediate utility of the material, the cognitive load required to process it often outweighs the perceived benefit. You must ensure that the training objectives are explicitly linked to organizational goals or specific job responsibilities to maintain high levels of motivation. Beyond Knowles, we must also consider David Kolb's experiential learning theory, which provides a cyclical model of how adults process information through experience. Kolb suggests that learning is a four-stage process involving concrete experience, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, and active experimentation. This cycle implies that it is not enough to simply do something. The learner must also reflect on the action, form a theory or model based on that reflection, and then test that theory in a new situation. As an HR professional, you should design learning interventions that touch on all four stages of this cycle. Some employees may prefer jumping straight into a task, while others may require time for quiet reflection before they feel comfortable applying a new concept. By providing opportunities for both action and reflection, you cater to a wider variety of learning styles and increase the likelihood that the training will result in a permanent change in behavior. Finally, we must acknowledge the role of intrinsic motivation in adult learning. While external rewards like salary increases or promotions can certainly drive participation, the most potent motivators for adults are often internal, such as increased job satisfaction, self-esteem, or a sense of personal growth. The PHR exam often tests your understanding of these psychological drivers because they influence how you should market and structure internal training programs. If you rely solely on mandatory compliance or external pressure, you may achieve attendance, but you will rarely achieve deep learning or behavioral change. Understanding these theories allows you to move beyond simply delivering content and instead focus on creating a supportive climate where learners feel safe to experiment, fail, and ultimately grow. By aligning your instructional strategies with the way the human brain naturally functions in adulthood, you ensure a higher return on investment for the organization's human capital. I hope this provides a solid theoretical foundation for your study of learning and development. See you in the next lecture. Hello, it is good to have you back. When an organization identifies a performance deficiency, the immediate reaction is often to schedule a training session, but this is frequently a mistake born of poor diagnostic habits. A training needs analysis, or TNA, is the systematic process of determining whether training is actually the solution to a business problem or if the issue stems from misaligned incentives, inadequate tools, or flawed processes. If you skip this investigative phase, you risk spending significant capital and time on a solution that provides zero return on investment because it addresses a symptom rather than the root cause. For the PHR exam, you must understand that modern HR is not just about delivering content. It is about ensuring that every educational intervention is explicitly tied to a measurable gap in performance. By following a structured approach to this analysis, we can move from reactive guesswork to data-driven decision-making that supports the broader organizational strategy. The first level of a comprehensive TNA is the organizational analysis, which looks at the enterprise from a macro perspective to determine where training fits within the high-level strategy. During this phase, you examine the company's goals, available resources, and the internal climate to see if the environment actually supports the transfer of new skills. If the executive leadership does not value technical proficiency, or if the budget is insufficient to sustain long-term behavioral changes, then even the best designed training program will inevitably fail. You need to identify whether the organizational culture is conducive to learning and whether there are legal or regulatory drivers that mandate specific types of instruction. Essentially, this step answers the question of why we are training and whether the organization is ready to provide the necessary support for employees to apply what they learn. Once the organizational context is established, we move to the task analysis, which focuses on the job itself rather than the person currently performing it. This level of analysis requires a deep dive into job descriptions and specifications to identify the specific knowledge, skills, and abilities, or KSAs, required to perform a role effectively. You are essentially mapping out the should of the position, defining the gold standard of performance for a particular set of responsibilities or tasks. Methods for gathering this data include observing high-performing employees, conducting interviews with subject matter experts, or reviewing technical manuals to list the sequential steps of a process. For the exam, remember that task analysis is objective and job-centric, providing the benchmark against which we will eventually measure the existing workforce's current capabilities. The final level is the individual analysis, where we turn our attention to the actual employees to determine who specifically needs training and what particular skills they lack. While the task analysis defined the standard, the individual analysis measures current performance against that standard to reveal the specific gap that needs to be bridged. You can gather this information through various means, such as performance appraisals, proficiency tests, peer reviews, or direct questionnaires where employees self-report their areas of struggle. It is crucial here to distinguish between a can't-do problem and a won't-do problem, as training only solves the former. If an employee has the necessary skills but lacks the motivation or the proper equipment, a training intervention will be a total waste of resources, and you should instead look toward performance management or process improvement. By synthesizing the data from the organizational, task, and individual levels, you create a robust roadmap for instructional design that is grounded in reality. This three-tiered approach ensures that your training objectives are not arbitrary, but are instead designed to solve specific, documented deficiencies that hinder the company's progress. It also allows HR professionals to justify the cost of training initiatives to senior management by presenting clear evidence of the performance gaps that currently exist. When you have correctly identified that a gap exists because of a lack of knowledge or skill, and you have confirmed that the organization supports the solution, you are ready to move forward. This foundational work is what prevents HR departments from becoming order takers and instead positions them as strategic partners who solve real business problems. That covers the essential framework for analyzing training needs adequately. See you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. When we design training programs for an organization, we cannot simply rely on intuition or a collection of interesting slides if we want to achieve measurable results. Professional instructional design requires a systematic framework to ensure that the learning experience is both predictable and effective. The most prominent framework in this field is the ADDIE model, which functions as a structural blueprint for developing any educational intervention. ADDIE is an acronym representing 5 distinct phases: analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. By following this sequence, an HR professional ensures that the training actually addresses a performance gap rather than existing as a redundant exercise. Each phase produces an output that serves as the essential input for the subsequent step, creating a logical chain of project management. Without such a model, training often becomes disorganized, fails to meet specific business objectives, or targets the wrong audience entirely. The process begins with the analysis phase, which is perhaps the most critical part of the entire instructional design lifecycle. During this stage, you must identify the current state of employee performance and compare it against the desired organizational standard to define the gap. You are also responsible for identifying the target audience's existing knowledge, their learning preferences, and any potential constraints such as budget or time. This phase results in a set of clear, measurable goals that will govern the rest of the project. If the analysis is flawed, the entire training program will likely fail because it will be solving a problem that does not exist or providing information that employees already possess. It is about understanding the why before you ever determine the what or the how. You must ensure that the proposed training is actually the correct solution for the business problem identified. Once the analysis is complete, you move into the design phase, where the architectural planning of the course takes place. This involves creating a detailed outline, selecting the appropriate delivery methods, and drafting the instructional strategy. You must define the specific learning objectives and determine how you will measure success through assessments or practical exercises. This is also where you decide on the sequence of the content, ensuring a logical flow that builds from foundational concepts to more complex ideas. The focus here is on the cognitive map of a learner and how to best facilitate the transfer of information. It is essentially the storyboard phase where you visualize how the content will be presented to maximize engagement and retention. You are not yet creating the final materials, but rather defining the parameters of what those materials will become. During the development phase, the plans from the design stage are finally turned into tangible assets. This is the stage where you write the scripts, record the videos, create the slide decks, and program any interactive elements of an e-learning module. You are essentially building the product based on the blueprints created in the previous two phases. It is often necessary to conduct a pilot test or a small-scale review during this phase to ensure the materials are accurate and technically functional. This allows for iterative improvements before the program is launched to the entire organization. Quality control is paramount here, as errors in the development phase can lead to confusion and a loss of credibility once the training goes live. You must verify that the content is visually consistent and that every piece of media directly supports a learning objective. The implementation phase involves the actual delivery of the training to the target audience. This is where the logistics of the program come to the forefront, including scheduling sessions, enrolling participants, and ensuring that the learning environment is prepared. If the training is instructor-led, this phase includes the briefing of facilitators to ensure they understand the instructional goals. If it is delivered via a learning management system, you must ensure that all technical integrations are functioning correctly for the end users. This stage is where the theoretical design meets the reality of the workplace environment. It is the moment when the learners interact with the developed content and begin the process of skill acquisition. Effective implementation requires careful coordination to ensure that the disruption to daily business operations is minimized while the learning impact is maximized. Finally, the evaluation phase measures the effectiveness of the training program and determines whether the initial objectives were met. Evaluation actually occurs in two forms: formative and summative. Formative evaluation takes place throughout the entire ADDI process, allowing for adjustments at each stage to improve the final outcome. Summative evaluation happens after implementation and focuses on the final results, often using models like Kirkpatrick's levels to measure reaction, learning, behavior changes, and business results. This data is vital for demonstrating the return on investment to stakeholders and identifying areas for future improvement. Without evaluation, you cannot prove that the training provided any value or if it should be repeated in the future. It closes the loop of the instructional design process, providing the necessary feedback to restart the cycle for the next iteration. I hope this provides a clear understanding of how systematic models like ADDI prevent training from becoming an ad hoc or ineffective process. See you in the next lecture. Hello. It is good to have you back as we continue our exploration of learning and development. Allocating resources to training programs without a formal mechanism for measurement is an exercise in hope rather than an act of strategic management. As HR professionals, we must move beyond the assumption that because a training session occurred, value was created for the organization. Evaluating training effectiveness is the process of quantifying the impact of instructional interventions on individual performance and organizational goals. Without this data, you cannot justify the training budget or identify whether the instructional design successfully addressed the original performance gap. We rely on structured frameworks to transform subjective impressions into objective data points that satisfy executive scrutiny. The most prevalent framework for this task remains Kirkpatrick's four-level training evaluation model, which provides a sequential approach to measuring impact. The first level of evaluation focuses on participant reaction, which essentially measures how the learners felt about the training experience. At this stage, we collect data regarding the perceived relevance of the material, the quality of the facilitation, and the suitability of the learning environment. This is typically achieved through post-training surveys, often colloquially referred to as smile sheets. While high satisfaction scores do not prove that learning occurred, low scores are often a reliable indicator that barriers prevented effective knowledge transfer. If the participants found the delivery confusing or irrelevant, the likelihood of successful outcomes at higher levels is significantly diminished. However, a common mistake in HR is stopping at level 1, which provides no evidence of a return on the organization's investment. Level 2 moves into the territory of actual learning, where we measure the increase in knowledge or skills resulting from the program. To do this effectively, you must establish a baseline through pre-tests and compare those results against post-training assessments. These assessments can take many forms, including written exams, skills demonstrations, or simulations designed to replicate real-world scenarios. The goal here is to determine if the instructional objectives were met and if the participants internalized the specific content delivered. If a participant cannot demonstrate the skill in a controlled environment immediately after training, they certainly will not be able to perform it on the job. This level provides the data necessary to validate the technical effectiveness of the instructional design itself. Transfer of training is the focus of Level 3, which evaluates behavioral changes on the job. This is arguably the most critical stage because training is ultimately a failure if the learner returns to their desk and continues to work exactly as they did before. Measuring behavior change usually requires waiting several months and then collecting data through observations, peer feedback, or performance appraisals. We must ask whether the new skills are being applied consistently and whether the organizational culture supports the adoption of these new behaviors. Constraints such as lack of management reinforcement or inadequate tools often prevent behavior transfer, regardless of how well the employee learned the material during the session. Identifying these bottlenecks is a key responsibility of the HR professional during the evaluation process. Level 4 addresses the ultimate results and the impact on the organization's bottom line. This level looks at high-level metrics such as increased sales, reduced turnover, improved quality scores, or fewer safety incidents. By correlating these shifts with the timing of the training intervention, we can begin to claim a causal link between development and organizational success. Beyond the standard 4 levels, we often consider a 5th level, which is the specific calculation of return on investment, or ROI. This involves subtracting the total cost of the training program from the monetary value of the results obtained and expressing it as a percentage. When you can demonstrate that a program yielded a specific dollar amount for every dollar spent, HR moves from being a cost center to a strategic partner. I look forward to seeing you in the next session. Hello and welcome back. Career development programs represent the intersection where an organization's long-term human capital requirements meet the individual aspirations of its workforce. While training often focuses on immediate job-related skills, development is a longitudinal process aimed at equipping employees for future roles and broader responsibilities. For the PHR exam, you must understand that these programs are not merely perks. They are strategic investments designed to improve retention, enhance succession planning, and maintain competitive advantage. When an organization fails to provide a clear growth trajectory, it risks losing its most capable talent to competitors who offer a more defined path forward. Effective programs require a systematic approach that balances the subjective desires of the employee with the objective needs of the operational structure. This involves a rigorous analysis of existing skill gaps and a projection of the competencies the organization will require in the coming years. By formalizing these pathways, HR professionals ensure that the transition of leadership and specialist knowledge occurs with minimal friction. Coaching and mentoring are two distinct but complementary pillars of career development that often appear in exam questions. Coaching typically involves a more formal, task-oriented relationship where a manager or third party helps an employee improve specific performance areas or develop new skills through structured feedback. It is usually short-term and focuses on immediate behavioral change or competency acquisition. Mentoring, by contrast, is a more holistic, relationship-oriented process where a more experienced professional provides long-term guidance, psychosocial support, and political navigation within a company. Unlike coaching, mentoring is often less formal and focuses on the mentee's overall professional maturity rather than a specific set of operational tasks. For a development program to be robust, it should ideally incorporate both elements, allowing employees to receive the tactical correction they need through coaching while benefiting from the strategic wisdom found in mentoring. Understanding the nuance between these two methodologies is essential for designing a culture that supports continuous professional evolution. Job rotation and lateral movement serve as practical mechanisms for broadening an employee's understanding of the business beyond their immediate silo. Job rotation involves moving employees through a series of pre-planned assignments in different functional areas or departments. This approach is particularly effective for high-potential employees because it provides them with a holistic view of how various units interact to create value. From a risk management perspective, rotation also builds a more resilient workforce where multiple individuals can perform critical tasks, thereby reducing the impact of sudden turnover. It breaks down the departmental echo chambers that often hinder organizational agility and cross-functional collaboration. However, successful rotation requires careful planning to ensure that the duration of each assignment is long enough for the employee to learn, but not so long that they become stagnant. When implemented correctly, these initiatives convert specialized individual contributors into versatile organizational survivors who are better prepared for general management roles. The process of career pathing involves creating a transparent roadmap that shows how an individual can progress through the various levels of an organization. This is not always a vertical climb. Modern career paths often include dual career ladders, which allow technical experts to advance in prestige and compensation without being forced into management roles they may not be suited for. To map out these paths effectively, HR must identify the core competencies required at each level and communicate these requirements clearly to the workforce. This transparency helps align the employee's self-assessment and personal ambition with reality, reducing future dissatisfaction or mismatched expectations. It also provides the basis for individual development plans, IDPs, which serve as a contract between the employee and the organization regarding specific growth goals. When employees see a viable future within the firm, their engagement levels typically rise, and the organization benefits from a more predictable internal talent pipeline. Strategic career pathing ensures that the right people are being prepared for the right roles at the right time. Implementing these programs requires a data-driven approach rather than relying on an ad hoc or purely intuitive selection of participants. HR professionals must use performance data, potential assessments, and gap analyses to determine where development resources should be concentrated. Investing in a career development program without measuring its impact on turnover rates or internal promotion success is a missed opportunity for strategic validation. You should be aware that these programs must be inclusive and equitable to avoid legal risks related to disparate treatment in professional opportunities. The ultimate goal is to create a self-sustaining ecosystem where talent is nurtured systematically, ensuring that the organization's human capital remains its most durable asset. By integrating mentoring, coaching, and rotation into the standard operating procedure, the HR department transforms from a purely administrative function into a strategic partner that dictates the future capability of the firm. Mastering these concepts will allow you to answer exam questions that focus on the long-term sustainability of the workforce. I will see you in the next lesson. Welcome back to our exploration of learning and development, where we now turn our attention to the mechanics of performance management. Performance management is often misunderstood as a static, annual ritual, but for the purposes of the PHR exam, you must view it as a continuous cycle. This cycle begins with the establishment of performance expectations that align with the broader strategic goals of the organization. If an employee does not understand how their work contributes to the company's success, the system fails before it truly begins. We define this process as a collaborative effort between the manager and the employee to identify, measure, and develop the performance of individuals and teams. It is not merely a mechanism for documentation or compliance, though those are necessary side effects. Instead, an effective system focuses on enhancing output through consistent engagement and clarity. By treating performance as a dynamic flow rather than a fixed event, HR professionals can ensure that talent is being utilized effectively throughout the entire fiscal year. The foundation of any robust performance system is the creation of SMART goals, an acronym representing specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound objectives. When goals are vague, measurement becomes subjective, which introduces bias and legal risk into the appraisal process. A specific goal defines exactly what needs to be accomplished, while the measurable component identifies the metrics used to track progress. Achievability ensures the employee is not being set up for failure, which would damage morale and retention. Relevance connects the individual's tasks to the department's mission, and the time-bound element provides a clear deadline for completion. For example, rather than telling a sales representative to increase sales, a SMART goal would be to increase new client acquisitions by 10% by the end of the third quarter. This level of precision allows for objective evaluation and leaves little room for interpretation during the formal review. Once goals are set, the system shifts into the monitoring and feedback phase, which is perhaps the most critical component for long-term development. Traditional systems rely on lagging indicators, which are metrics that look backward at what has already happened, often when it is too late to change the outcome. Modern performance management emphasizes leading indicators through continuous feedback loops that allow for real-time course corrections. Constructive feedback should be specific, behavioral, and timely. Waiting 6 months to address a performance deficiency is an inefficient use of human capital. Managers should focus on observable behaviors rather than personality traits to maintain professionalism and objectivity. For instance, pointing out that a report was submitted late 3 times is a behavioral fact, whereas calling an employee disorganized is a subjective characterization. This distinction is vital for maintaining a development-focused culture that seeks to solve problems rather than assign blame. The formal performance appraisal serves as the documentation of the discussions that should have been occurring throughout the year. There are various methods for conducting these appraisals, such as the graphic rating scale, the force distribution method, or the 360-degree feedback model. The graphic rating scale is common but prone to central tendency bias, where managers rate everyone as average. Force distribution, while useful for identifying top and bottom performers, can sometimes damage collaboration by creating an overly competitive environment. The 360-degree feedback approach gathers input from peers, subordinates, and customers, providing a holistic view of the employee's impact. Regardless of the method chosen, the appraisal must be treated as a summary of the ongoing dialogue. If an employee is surprised by the feedback they receive during an annual review, the performance management system has failed in its primary duty of continuous communication. To transition from a compliance-driven model to a development-focused one, HR must train managers on the nuances of coaching. Coaching involves a shift in perspective from being a judge to being a facilitator of growth. This involves identifying gaps in skills or knowledge and providing the necessary resources or training to bridge those gaps. It also requires an understanding of the difference between a performance issue caused by a lack of ability and one caused by a lack of motivation. When an employee lacks ability, the solution is often found in the learning and development strategies we discussed in previous lessons. If the issue is motivation, the solution may lie in the total rewards or employee relations domains. Recognizing these distinctions ensures that the performance management system remains a tool for improvement rather than a purely punitive measure. Finally, the outputs of the performance management system must be integrated with other HR functions to create a cohesive talent strategy. The data gathered from appraisals should inform compensation decisions, promotion readiness, and succession planning. If the system is siloed, it loses its strategic value and becomes a bureaucratic burden. Furthermore, documenting performance accurately is essential for legal defensibility in cases of termination or promotion disputes. HR professionals must ensure that managers are documenting both successes and failures consistently across the workforce. A well-maintained system provides the empirical evidence needed to support administrative decisions while simultaneously driving the professional growth of the employee. By viewing performance management as a continuous loop of goal setting, observation, feedback, and evaluation, the organization can maintain a high-performing and engaged workforce. I hope this clarifies the structural requirements of managing output within an organization. I will see you in the next lesson. Welcome back to our exploration of total rewards. In this session, we will examine the architectural underpinnings of an effective compensation system. Designing a compensation system is not merely an administrative exercise, but a fundamental strategic endeavor that ensures an organization can maintain its human capital. At its core, the system must balance two often competing forces: internal equity and external market competitiveness. Internal equity refers to the perceived fairness of pay relative to different jobs within the same organization, ensuring that individuals and roles with similar value receive similar compensation. External competitiveness, on the other hand, involves benchmarking the organization's pay rates against what other employers are offering for similar talent. If you ignore internal equity, you risk damaging morale and creating friction between employees. Conversely, if you ignore the external market, you'll find it increasingly difficult to recruit and retain the specialized skills your business requires to function. A successful design provides a logical framework that addresses both dimensions while remaining within the financial constraints of the enterprise. The process typically begins with a rigorous job evaluation, which is a systematic way of determining the relative value of each position within the company. There are several common methods for this, starting with simple job ranking, where roles are ordered from most to least valuable based on subjective judgment. More sophisticated organizations often move toward the point factor method, which breaks jobs down into compensable factors like skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. Each factor is assigned a numeric value, and the total points determine the job's hierarchy within the structure. You might also encounter the factor comparison method, which is a complex quantitative approach that combines ranking and point allocation by assigning monetary values to specific factors. Regardless of the specific method chosen, the goal is to create a hierarchy that reflects the objective demands and contributions of each role rather than the characteristics of the individual currently holding it. Once the relative value of jobs is established, we must translate these hierarchies into a practical pay structure by creating pay grades and salary ranges. Pay grades are groups of jobs that have been determined to have approximately the same internal value, which simplifies the administration of the pay system. Each grade is then assigned a salary range, consisting of a minimum, a midpoint, and a maximum value. The midpoint is particularly significant because it usually represents the competitive market rate for a fully competent performer in that role. The width of these ranges, or the distance between the minimum and the maximum, often reflects the potential for growth and performance variance within that grade. For example, lower-level clerical roles might have narrower ranges, while senior management positions often have much wider ranges to account for broader performance impacts. Integrating these grades with the organization's financial strategy requires a focus on pay policy positioning. An organization must decide whether it intends to lead the market, lag the market, or meet the market in its pay levels. A lead-the-market strategy involves paying higher than the average competitor to attract the highest quality talent, which can reduce turnover but increases fixed labor costs significantly. A lag-the-market strategy might be necessary for organizations with severe budget constraints or those that offer other non-monetary rewards, though it often leads to higher recruitment challenges. A lead lag approach is also common, where an organization starts the year ahead of the market but ends the year slightly behind as inflation and market shifts occur. This decision must be deliberate, as it directly impacts the organization's ability to compete and its overall fiscal health. Maintaining the integrity of the compensation system over time requires ongoing monitoring and periodic adjustments based on market data. Salary surveys are the primary tool used here, allowing HR professionals to see how their current pay ranges align with the reality of the labor market. When you find that an employee's pay falls outside the established range, you must address these anomalies through specific adjustments. A green circle rate occurs when an employee's pay is below the minimum of the range, often requiring an immediate increase to ensure equity and compliance. A red circle rate happens when an employee is paid above the maximum, which might lead to freezing their pay until the range catches up or they move to a higher grade. Consistent application of these rules ensures that the system remains transparent, defensible, and aligned with the strategic goals of the business. I look forward to seeing you in the next session. Hello, and welcome back. In the realm of direct compensation, we distinguish between pay that is fixed and pay that is at risk. Base pay constitutes the foundational, fixed component of an employee's compensation, typically delivered as an hourly wage or an annual salary. It reflects the internal value of a job role as determined by job evaluation, as well as the external market value based on salary surveys. When we design base pay systems, we must decide whether to use a traditional graded structure or a more modern approach like broad banding. Traditional structures involve many narrow pay grades with specific minimums, midpoints, and maximums, which provide clear control over labor costs. Broad banding collapses these narrow grades into fewer, wider bands to encourage lateral movement and flexibility. However, regardless of the structure, base pay is usually non-discretionary once the employment contract is signed and serves as the primary driver for an employee's standard of living. It is the steady signal of value the organization places on a specific set of responsibilities and competencies. Variable pay, by contrast, is compensation that is not guaranteed and must be earned through specific performance outcomes or behaviors. Organizations use variable pay to align individual employee efforts with broader business goals, creating a line of sight between hard work and financial reward. This category encompasses a diverse range of plans, including short-term incentives like spot bonuses and commissions, as well as long-term incentives like profit sharing or stock options. While base pay rewards the presence and baseline competence of an employee, variable pay is designed to reward excellence, results, or longevity. For the PHR exam, you need to recognize that variable pay serves as a tool for cost management because the amount paid fluctuates with the organization's ability to pay. If the company does not meet its financial targets, the variable expense decreases naturally. This shifting of financial risk from the employer to the employee is a fundamental characteristic of these at-risk programs. Incentive structures must be carefully designed to ensure they drive the specific behaviors the organization desires without creating unintended negative consequences. Commissions are perhaps the most direct form of variable pay, often used in sales roles where a percentage of revenue generated is paid directly to the salesperson. While highly motivating, a commission-only structure might inadvertently encourage aggressive sales tactics that damage long-term customer relationships. Bonuses are typically more discreet, one-time payments given for achieving a specific milestone or for exceptional performance over a set period. We often see these in the form of sign-on bonuses, referral bonuses, or annual performance bonuses based on a scorecard of metrics. When designing these, the HR professional must ensure the criteria are measurable, attainable, and communicated clearly to the participants. If the link between performance and payout becomes opaque, the incentive loses its psychological power and may even lead to employee resentment. Profit sharing and gain sharing represent more collaborative forms of variable pay that focus on group rather than individual achievement. Profit sharing plans distribute a portion of an organization's profits to employees, either in cash or as contributions to retirement accounts. These plans are effective at fostering a sense of ownership among the workforce, though the individual employee may feel they have little direct impact on the overall corporate profit margin. Gain sharing is more localized and specific. It rewards employees for improvements in productivity or cost savings within a specific unit or plant. The Scanlon plan is a classic example of gain sharing where employees are encouraged to offer suggestions for efficiency, and a portion of the resulting savings is shared back with the workers. For the exam, remember that gain sharing requires a high degree of trust and transparency between management and staff to function correctly. It relies on the assumption that employees are the best suited to identify waste in their immediate operational environment. The shift toward a higher ratio of variable pay relative to base pay is a trend often referred to as pay for performance. This strategy allows organizations to remain competitive in tight labor markets by offering high upside potential without permanently inflating fixed labor costs. However, base pay remains the anchor of the employee's financial security and serves as the basis for calculating many other benefits, such as life insurance or disability coverage. A well-balanced compensation strategy uses base pay to attract and retain talent, while leveraging variable pay to motivate and direct that talent towards strategic objectives. You must be able to explain how these two components interact within a total rewards framework. For instance, an aggressive growth company might offer lower than average base pay, but a very high commission or profit sharing potential. In contrast, a stable government entity might offer a higher, more predictable base pay with little to no variable component. Understanding these trade-offs is essential for any human resources professional managing a compensation program. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our exploration of total reward strategy. We are now shifting our focus from direct monetary compensation to the architecture of benefit programs and their administration. Employee benefits represent a sophisticated component of the total rewards ecosystem, often accounting for 30% or more of an organization's total labor costs. For the PHR candidate, it is necessary to distinguish between legally mandated benefits and those an organization offers voluntarily to remain competitive in the labor market. Governments require specific contributions, such as Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment insurance, which serve as a foundational social safety net for the workforce. In addition to these, workers' compensation is a mandatory, employer-funded insurance program providing medical benefits and wage replacement to employees injured in the course of employment. Understanding these requirements is not merely a legal hurdle, but a fundamental aspect of financial planning within the human resources function. Failing to account for the employer portion of payroll taxes or mandated insurance premiums can lead to significant budgetary discrepancies and legal liabilities. Beyond what is legally required, organizations design voluntary benefit packages to attract and retain specific talent pools. Health insurance remains the most significant voluntary benefit, encompassing complex structures like health maintenance organizations, HMOs, preferred provider organizations, PPOs, and high-deductible health plans, HDHPs. Each of these models involves a different trade-off between premium costs, provider flexibility, and out-of-pocket expenses for the employee. As an HR professional, you must be able to evaluate how these plans align with the demographic needs of your workforce while managing the organization's financial exposure. Often, these health plans are coupled with ancillary benefits like dental, vision, and life insurance to create a comprehensive safety net. The strategic value of these offerings lies in their ability to mitigate the financial stress of employees, thereby theoretically increasing productivity and organizational commitment. Retirement plans constitute another pillar of the benefit strategy, typically categorized into defined benefit and defined contribution plans. Defined benefit plans, often referred to as traditional pensions, promise a specific monthly benefit upon retirement based on salary history and years of service. Conversely, defined contribution plans, such as 401k or 403b accounts, shift the investment risk from the employer to the employee. The employer's role in a defined contribution landscape involves selecting a plan provider, determining the matching contribution strategy, and ensuring compliance with the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA. ERISA is a critical piece of legislation for the exam, as it sets minimum standards for most voluntarily established pension and health plans in private industry to provide protection for individuals in these plans. You should be familiar with its reporting requirements and the fiduciary responsibilities it imposes on plan administrators. Paid time off, PTO, and wellness initiatives have evolved from simple administrative tasks into strategic tools for managing employee burnout and long-term health. A unified PTO policy combines vacation days, sick leave, and personal time into a single bank, offering employees greater flexibility while simplifying tracking for the employer. However, HR must still navigate various state-specific laws regarding the carryover of these hours or the payout of unused time upon termination. Wellness programs have also gained traction as a method to proactively manage healthcare costs by encouraging healthy behaviors through incentives or subsidized gym memberships. While these programs vary in complexity, their administration must be handled carefully to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA. Protecting employee privacy regarding health information is a non-negotiable requirement of benefit administration. Effective administration of these programs requires a rigorous adherence to various compliance frameworks beyond just ERISA and HIPAA. The Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, COBRA, mandates that employers provide a temporary extension of health coverage to employees who lose their benefits due to specific qualifying events, such as termination or reduced hours. Understanding the timelines for notification and the maximum duration of coverage is essential for the PHR exam. Furthermore, the Family and Medical Leave Act, FMLA, requires covered employers to provide employees with job-protected, unpaid leave for qualified medical and family reasons. Managing the intersection of FMLA with disability insurance and existing PTO policies is one of the more granular tasks an HR administrator faces. You must ensure that the organization's internal policies do not inadvertently violate these federal protections. The logistics of enrollment and ongoing communication are where benefit strategy meets operational reality. Open enrollment periods are the primary window for employees to make elections, and they require meticulous planning to ensure all participants are informed of changes in coverage or costs. Self-service portals have streamlined this process, yet the HR department remains the primary point of contact for complex inquiries. An effective administrator should also conduct regular benefits audits to ensure that the individuals enrolled are truly eligible and that the premiums billed by insurance carriers match the payroll deductions. This level of oversight prevents wasteful spending and ensures the integrity of the benefits data. Ultimately, benefit administration is an exercise in balancing the human needs of the workforce with the regulatory and financial constraints of the business entity. I look forward to discussing executive compensation basics with you in the next lecture. Goodbye. Hello again. Let's look at how organizations structure compensation for their top-tier leadership. Executive compensation differs fundamentally from standard employee pay because it must address the agency problem, where the interests of the managers might diverge from those of the owners. In a typical employment contract, we focus on fair market value for specific tasks, but for executives, the goal is to shift the focus toward long-term value creation. This necessitates a complex mix of base salary, short-term incentives, and long-term equity-based rewards. When you design these packages, you're not just paying for time. You're creating a motivational framework that attempts to mitigate risk-averse behavior while discouraging short-term manipulation of financial reports. Regulatory bodies and shareholders scrutinize these packages closely, requiring a level of transparency and justification that rarely applies to the general workforce. Understanding these nuances is essential for any HR professional involved in corporate governance or high-level strategic planning. Equity-based compensation serves as the primary mechanism for aligning executive behavior with shareholder wealth. Stock options give an executive the right to purchase company shares at a fixed price, known as the strike price, after a specific vesting period. If the company's stock price rises above that strike price, the executive profits from the appreciation, which theoretically encourages them to make decisions that increase the firm's market value. However, options can also encourage excessive risk-taking because the executive gains significantly on the upside, but loses nothing if the stock price falls below the strike price. To counter this, many organizations use restricted stock units, or RSUs, which represent an actual grant of shares that the executive receives only after meeting certain time-based or performance-based milestones. Unlike options, RSUs always retain some value unless the stock price drops to zero, which tends to promote a more balanced approach to long-term stability and growth. Another critical component in the executive suite is the use of deferred compensation and supplemental retirement plans. Because federal laws often limit the amount of money highly compensated employees can contribute to qualified retirement plans like 401(k)s, organizations implement non-qualified deferred compensation plans. These arrangements allow executives to defer a portion of their income until a later date, often retirement, which can provide significant tax advantages. You should be aware that these plans are typically unfunded and remain part of the company's general assets, meaning the executive is essentially an unsecured creditor of the corporation. This risk is another design element that ties the executive's personal financial future to the continued solvency and health of the organization. From a PHR exam perspective, knowing the distinction between qualified and non-qualified plans is vital for understanding how total rewards are partitioned at the top level. We must also consider the controversial but common practice of implementing golden parachutes within executive contracts. A golden parachute is a significant compensation package provided to an executive if their employment is terminated following a change in ownership, such as a merger or acquisition. While often criticized by the public, these clauses are designed to ensure that executives remain objective during stay-or-go negotiations rather than fighting a beneficial merger just to save their jobs. These packages might include cash bonuses, accelerated vesting of stock options, and extended benefits packages. However, the Internal Revenue Code imposes strict tax penalties on what it deems excessive parachute payments, which usually means payments exceeding 3 times the executive's average annual compensation. As an HR professional, you must navigate these regulatory limits to ensure the organization does not incur unnecessary tax liabilities while still providing the necessary security for its leaders. Finally, the concept of clawback provisions has become a mandatory element of executive compensation under modern regulatory frameworks like the Dodd-Frank Act. A clawback provision allows, and sometimes requires, a company to recover incentive-based compensation already paid to an executive if it is later discovered that the payment was based on inaccurate financial results. This serves as a deterrent against accounting fraud and ensures that leaders are held accountable for the integrity of the organization's financial reporting. Designing an effective compensation strategy requires balancing these protective measures with the need to attract and retain high-caliber talent in a competitive global market. When you evaluate these programs, always look for the underlying logic of how each component drives specific behaviors. If the incentives are poorly aligned, even the most talented executive can be led to prioritize the wrong outcomes for the business. I'll see you in the next lesson. Welcome back. Today we're looking at the mechanics of payroll and the regulatory landscape that governs how we compensate employees. At the core of payroll administration lies the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, which establishes the baseline for minimum wage, overtime pay, record keeping, and youth employment standards. When we manage payroll, we are not merely performing an accounting task, but are instead ensuring compliance with a complex set of federal mandates that dictate how time is tracked and valued. The first step in this process is the correct classification of workers as either exempt or non-exempt based on their job duties and salary levels. This classification determines whether an employee is eligible for overtime pay, which is a frequent source of litigation and regulatory fines if handled improperly. We must understand that an employee's title is irrelevant to this determination. Only the actual nature of the work and the method of compensation satisfy the Department of Labor's criteria. If we fail to classify a worker correctly, the liability for back pay and liquidated damages can be substantial for the organization. The distinction between exempt and non-exempt status requires a rigorous application of the salary basis test and the primary duties test. Non-exempt employees are entitled to the federal minimum wage and must be paid overtime at a rate of 1.5 times their regular rate of pay for all hours worked over 40 in a work week. The regular rate of pay is a concept that often causes confusion because it includes more than just the base hourly wage. It must also account for non-discretionary bonuses, shift differentials, and commissions. We define a work week as a fixed and regularly recurring period of 168 hours, which is 7 consecutive 24-hour periods. It does not need to coincide with the calendar week, but it must be consistent. Employers are prohibited from averaging hours over 2 or more weeks to avoid overtime payments, regardless of whether the employee originates the request for such an arrangement. Tax compliance adds another layer of complexity to the payroll function, requiring a disciplined approach to withholding and reporting. As an employer, the organization is responsible for withholding federal income tax, Social Security, and Medicare taxes from employee wages under the Federal Insurance Contributions Act, or FICA. We must also account for federal unemployment tax, known as FUTA, which is an employer-paid tax used to fund state workforce agencies and unemployment benefits. Precise record-keeping is required by the FLSA, where we must maintain payroll records, collective bargaining agreements, and sales and purchase records for at least 3 years. Records on which wage computations are based, such as time cards and piecework tickets, should be kept for at least 2 years. These logs must be accurate and accessible, as the burden of proof in a wage and hour audit almost always rests on the employer rather than the employee. Managing payroll also involves the administration of garnishments and other statutory deductions that the organization is legally bound to process. A wage garnishment is a legal procedure in which a portion of an employee's earnings is required by court order to be withheld for the payment of a debt, such as child support or defaulted loans. The Consumer Credit Protection Act limits the amount of earnings that can be garnished in any 1 week and protects employees from being terminated because their wages have been garnished for any one single indebtedness. We must ensure that these deductions are localized and processed before any voluntary deductions, such as health insurance premiums or retirement contributions, are taken out. This prioritization is critical because statutory obligations take precedence over contractual or elective ones. Any deviation from these priorities can result in legal complications for the HR department or the payroll administrator. Finally, we must consider the implications of state and local laws, which may impose more stringent requirements than federal regulations. If a state law requires a higher minimum wage or a more generous overtime calculation than the FLSA, the employer is legally obligated to follow the standard that is most favorable to the employee. This principle applies across all facets of payroll, including the frequency of paydays and the timing of final paychecks upon termination. Some jurisdictions require that an employee receive their final wages immediately upon involuntary separation, while others allow for the next scheduled payday. Our role is to maintain a system that is robust enough to handle these variations while ensuring that every transaction is documented with a clear audit trail. Consistency in these processes reduces the risk of errors and demonstrates a commitment to legal and ethical standards in compensation. That covers the foundational aspects of payroll compliance and administration. See you in the next lecture. Hello, it is good to have you back for this discussion on the finalization of the compensation lifecycle. A total reward strategy is not a static artifact that you can simply set and forget, as the internal and external environments are constantly shifting. To maintain an edge in the labor market while ensuring fiscal responsibility, you must perform periodic audits of your entire rewards portfolio to see if it still aligns with the organizational goals. This evaluation involves benchmarking your current offerings against the broader market through the meticulous analysis of compensation surveys. You should look for trends in base pay, bonuses, and non-monetary benefits to identify if your organization is leading, matching, or lagging behind the market. It is often the case that an organization believes its package is competitive, only to find during an audit that specific roles are being gazumped by competitors offering better ancillary benefits or more flexible variable pay structures. Effective evaluation requires that you look past the raw salary numbers and consider the total cost of employment compared to the perceived value provided to the workforce. When you dive into compensation surveys, you must approach the data with a critical, analytical mindset to avoid making decisions based on skewed information. These surveys provide a snapshot of what other organizations are paying for similar roles, but you must ensure that the job matches are accurate and that the data is statistically significant. You will often encounter mean, median, and various percentile markers, and it is usually the median or the 50th percentile that serves as the most reliable indicator of the market rate. If your strategy is to be a market leader, you might target the 75th percentile, whereas a cost leadership strategy might aim for the 40th or 50th. You also need to account for geographic differentials and industry-specific demand, which can cause significant variance in the data. By normalizing this data, you can build a more accurate picture of where your organization stands and identify specific areas where adjustments are necessary to prevent turnover or recruitment difficulties. The utility of a robust total rewards package is significantly diminished if the employees do not actually understand or perceive its full value. This is a common failure in HR management where the organization spends a fortune on benefits, yet the staff only focuses on the net pay appearing in their bank accounts. To bridge this gap, you must implement a clear communication strategy that articulates the hidden pay, such as employer-sponsored insurance premiums, retirement contributions, and paid time off. This is not about bragging, but about providing transparency so that employees can make informed decisions about their careers. When an employee understands the full scope of their compensation, they're less likely to be swayed by a slightly higher base salary offer from a competitor that lacks the same level of comprehensive support. Clear communication serves as a reinforcement mechanism that validates the employee's choice to remain with the organization. Total reward statements are the primary tool for delivering this information in a consumable format, often serving as a catalyst for improved employee retention. A well-designed statement aggregates every component of an individual's compensation into a single, comprehensive report, quantifying the monetary value of every benefit provided. This includes the obvious elements like base salary and bonuses, but also highlights the employer's share of statutory taxes and private insurance costs. By presenting this data visually, you transform abstract benefits into concrete numbers that demonstrate the organization's true investment in the individual. We often see a marked increase in employee satisfaction scores following the introduction of these statements, simply because the ambiguity surrounding the rewards package has been removed. High-performing organizations use these statements annually to reinforce the psychological contract between the employer and the employee, ensuring that the total value proposition is never taken for granted. Ultimately, The evaluation of total rewards is a balancing act between external competitiveness, internal equity, and the organization's ability to pay. You must continuously monitor the participation rates in your benefit programs to see which offerings are valued and which are underutilized. If you're paying for an expensive dental plan that only 5% of your staff uses, that capital might be better allocated toward a retirement match or a professional development fund. This data-driven approach allows you to optimize the return on investment for your total rewards spend while maximizing the impact on employee morale. Retention is rarely about one single factor, but rather the cumulative effect of a reward strategy that feels fair, comprehensive, and tailored to the needs of the workforce. By keeping a close eye on these metrics, you can make incremental adjustments that keep the organization agile in a competitive talent landscape. I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Hello, it is good to see you again. At its core, a workplace is a social structure, and its efficiency is largely determined by the quality of the interactions between its members. As an HR professional, your role is to act as an architect for these relationships, moving beyond mere administrative tasks to foster an environment characterized by mutual respect and trust. While it might seem abstract, relationship building is a quantifiable asset that directly influences employee retention and organizational stability. When employees feel that management values their contributions and respects their dignity, they are more likely to align their personal goals with the strategic objectives of the firm. This alignment is not a fortunate accident, but the result of deliberate strategies aimed at reducing the traditional friction between those who direct the work and those who perform it. For the PHR exam, you should understand that fostering these connections is a primary function of employee relations. Trust is the foundational component of any healthy workplace relationship, yet it is quite fragile and requires consistent reinforcement through transparency. Open communication is the mechanism through which this trust is delivered, necessitating that information flows in both directions rather than just from the top down. A climate of open communication means that employees feel safe sharing feedback, voicing concerns, and suggesting improvements without fear of retaliation or indifference. This requires management to be proactive in sharing organizational goals, successes, and even failures, which humanizes the leadership and reduces the uncertainty that often breeds anxiety. When transparency is the default setting, the likelihood of misunderstandings and industrial disputes decreases significantly. You should recognize that the HR department often serves as the facilitator for these communication channels, ensuring they remain clear and accessible to everyone in the hierarchy. Employee involvement initiatives represent a practical application of these relationship-building theories by giving workers a voice in how things are done. These programs can range from simple suggestion boxes to high-involvement work teams where employees have a genuine say in operational decision-making. By involving employees in the process, you're signaling that their expertise is recognized and that their presence is valued beyond the simple execution of assigned tasks. This sense of agency is a powerful driver of engagement, and it often leads to innovations that management might have overlooked from a purely administrative perspective. Furthermore, involvement programs help to break down the us versus them mentality that can plague larger organizations. When employees feel they have skin in the game, their commitment to the outcome of a project or a policy change increases substantially. Recognition programs serve as another critical lever for strengthening the bond between the organization and its workforce. These programs should not be confused with compensation. While compensation is a contractual exchange, recognition is a social exchange that validates an employee's effort and excellence. To be effective, recognition should be timely, specific, and tied to the values of the organization. A generic Employee of the Month plaque often carries less weight than a specific note of appreciation for a problem solved or a client successfully managed. When workers see that their extra effort is noticed and appreciated, it reinforces positive behaviors and sets a benchmark for others to follow. From a strategic standpoint, recognition is a low-cost, high-impact tool for maintaining morale and fostering a culture where excellence is the norm. The impact of these interpersonal relationships extends far beyond the emotional well-being of the staff, directly affecting organizational morale and productivity. High morale is essentially the collective result of positive individual relationships, and it creates a resilient workforce that can better handle the stresses of market fluctuations or internal transitions. Productivity is often a byproduct of this environment, as employees who feel respected and heard are generally more motivated to perform at their peak. Conversely, a toxic environment where relationships are neglected leads to higher absenteeism, increased turnover costs, and a general decline in service quality. Therefore, you must view relationship building not as a secondary soft skill, but as a critical business imperative that sustains the organization's human capital. Understanding these dynamics will serve you well as you prepare for the complexities of employee and labor relations. I hope this provided a clear perspective on fostering workplace connections. I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the mechanical and legal frameworks required to manage employee misconduct and performance failures. When an employee fails to meet the standards of the organization, a structured response is necessary to mitigate legal risk and ensure fairness. The most common framework used in professional environments is progressive discipline, which operates on the principle that the severity of the penalty should increase if the behavior persists. This system typically begins with an informal counseling session or a verbal warning, moving toward written warnings, suspensions, and eventually termination. The goal of this progression is rarely to punish for the sake of punishment, but rather to provide the employee with a clear path toward correction. By clearly documenting each step, an HR professional establishes a chronological trail of evidence that demonstrates the organization's commitment to due process. If a case eventually reaches an administrative body or a court, the existence of this graduated response serves as primary evidence that the employer acted reasonably. Before any disciplinary action is taken, especially in cases involving misconduct rather than performance, a thorough and impartial workplace investigation must occur. You should approach an investigation as a neutral fact finder, gathering physical evidence, reviewing digital logs, and conducting interviews with relevant witnesses. It is vital to maintain confidentiality to the extent possible, though you should never promise absolute secrecy, as the information may need to be disclosed during legal proceedings. During interviews, it is best to ask open-ended questions that allow the subject to provide their version of events without being led by the investigator. Each interview should be memorialized in detailed notes that are signed and dated by the investigator to ensure their integrity. An investigation that lacks objectivity or fails to consider the accused employee's perspective can undermine the entire disciplinary process and lead to claims of discrimination or retaliation. The weight of any disciplinary decision rests heavily on the quality of the documentation produced throughout the process. Objective documentation must focus strictly on observable facts, dates, times, and specific behaviors rather than subjective feelings or vague characterizations. For instance, stating that an employee was lazy is a subjective opinion that holds little value in a legal context. Stating that the employee missed 3 deadlines in a 2-week period is a verifiable fact. Documented warnings should also include the specific policy that was violated and the explicit consequences of failing to improve. This creates a clear understanding between the employer and the employee, leaving no room for claims of ambiguity. Consistent documentation across the entire workforce is equally important to avoid disparate treatment claims, where one employee is punished more harshly than another for the same offense. Providing due process within an organization involves giving the employee notice of the allegations against them and a meaningful opportunity to respond before a final decision is made. This concept is often referred to as Loudermill rights in the public sector, but the underlying principle of fairness is a best practice in the private sector as well. You must ensure that the employee understands the evidence against them and has the chance to offer explanations or mitigating circumstances. Skipping this step can make an otherwise justified termination appear arbitrary or retaliatory. In a PHR context, following due process is not just a moral obligation, but a risk management strategy designed to exhaust all internal remedies. When an employee feels they have been heard, they are statistically less likely to pursue external litigation against the company. Termination is the final stage of the disciplinary process and should be executed with precision and professionalism to minimize friction. You should only proceed with termination when all other corrective measures have failed or if the employee has committed an act of gross misconduct that warrants immediate separation. The termination meeting should be kept brief, usually involving the direct supervisor and an HR representative to serve as a witness. It is important to have all necessary paperwork ready, including information on final pay, benefits continuation, and the return of company property. You should avoid getting into a lengthy debate or negotiation during the meeting. The decision should be presented as final and based on the documented history of the case. Properly managing the exit process ensures that the transition is handled safely and that the organization's reputation remains intact despite the difficult circumstances. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. We are now going to examine how organizations move beyond basic legal compliance toward a functional culture of diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion are often grouped together in HR literature, but they represent distinct operational concepts that require different management strategies. Diversity refers to the composition of the workforce, encompassing the various backgrounds, perspectives, and identities that employees bring to the organization. Inclusion, however, is the behavioral and cultural manifestation of how those differences are integrated into the daily workflow. A diverse team that is not inclusive will likely suffer from high turnover and low engagement, as minority voices may be marginalized during decision-making processes. For the PHR exam, it is important to understand that diversity is a state of being, while inclusion is an active set of practices designed to ensure that every employee feels valued and possesses equal access to advancement. When these two elements align, the organization typically sees an increase in innovation because diverse cognitive styles lead to more robust problem solving. Implementing effective diversity initiatives requires a structured approach that starts with an objective analysis of current organizational demographics and cultural norms. You should treat the implementation of a diversity and inclusion program much like any other strategic initiative, beginning with a clear definition of goals and key performance indicators. This often involves conducting stay interviews or climate surveys to identify where barriers to inclusion might exist within the employee lifecycle. Common initiatives include establishing employee resource groups, which provide a platform for individuals with shared characteristics to support one another and advise leadership. However, such groups are only effective if they have executive sponsorship and are integrated into the broader business strategy rather than functioning as isolated social clubs. By formalizing these programs, an HR professional ensures that the initiative remains sustainable even through various leadership changes or shifts in the economic climate. A significant obstacle to true inclusion is unconscious bias, which consists of the mental shortcuts or stereotypes that influence our decisions without our conscious awareness. In the context of HR, these biases frequently manifest during recruitment, performance evaluations, and promotion cycles, often resulting in systemic inequities even when no overt discrimination is intended. To mitigate these biases, you must implement standardized processes that reduce the subjectivity of individual managers. One example is the use of blind resume screening, where identifying information, such as name or university, is removed to ensure the candidate is evaluated solely on their technical merits. Another effective technique is the use of structured interviews, where every candidate is asked the same set of predetermined questions scored against a rubric. By introducing these constraints into organizational processes, you decrease the likelihood that an interviewer's affinity bias will unfairly favor a candidate who shares a similar background. Managing the dynamics of diverse work groups requires a high degree of cultural competence from both leadership and individual contributors. When people from different backgrounds work together, there's an increased potential for task-related conflict, which, if managed correctly, can actually improve the quality of the final output. The role of HR is to train managers to recognize the difference between healthy debate and interpersonal friction that stems from cultural misunderstandings. This might involve teaching communication strategies that account for direct versus indirect communication styles, often found in global or diverse teams. For instance, a manager might need to adjust their feedback loop to ensure that team members who come from high-context cultures feel comfortable sharing their insights. Successful management of these groups relies on creating a psychologically safe environment where team members believe they can take risks without being penalized for their unique perspectives. The business case for diversity and inclusion extends far beyond avoiding litigation or fulfilling a moral imperative. It is a fundamental requirement for competing in a global marketplace. An inclusive environment allows an organization to better understand and serve a diverse customer base, ultimately leading to higher market share and better financial performance. From a risk management perspective, a strong culture of belonging also reduces the likelihood of grievances and internal disputes that can drain organizational resources. As you prepare for the exam, remember that successful inclusion is a continuous process of evaluation and adjustment rather than a checkbox on a compliance list. You must remain vigilant about how organizational policies, even those that seem neutral, might inadvertently exclude certain groups. By maintaining this critical perspective, you ensure that the organization remains a meritocracy where talent is the primary driver of success. I hope this provides a clear framework for understanding your role in fostering an inclusive workplace. I will see you in the next lecture. Hello. To understand the landscape of employee and labor relations, we must first look at the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, often referred to as the Wagner Act. This legislation fundamentally changed the power dynamic in the American workplace by granting employees the legal right to form or join unions and to engage in collective bargaining. As an HR professional, you need to recognize that this act established the National Labor Relations Board, which serves as the federal agency responsible for enforcing these rights and overseeing union elections. The Act protects what it calls concerted activity, which occurs when two or more employees act together to improve their terms and conditions of employment. It is a common misconception that these rights only apply to union members. In reality, even in non-union environments, employees are protected when they discuss wages or working conditions together. Understanding the foundational shift this law created is necessary for managing any modern workforce. The process of union organizing typically begins long before management becomes aware of a formal campaign, often starting with internal dissatisfaction that leads employees to contact a labor organization. A formal campaign begins when a union attempts to collect signed authorization cards from the workforce to demonstrate sufficient interest in representation. According to NLRB rules, if at least 30% of the employees in a defined bargaining unit sign these cards, the union can petition for a secret ballot election. During this period, HR must be vigilant but careful, as federal law strictly limits how management can respond to organizing efforts. You might see a union focus on issues like perceived favoritism, stagnant wages, or lack of safety protocols to gain traction during this phase. If the union wins a majority of the votes cast in the election, they are certified as the exclusive representative for all employees in that bargaining unit. When a union is organizing, management must adhere to specific legal boundaries often remembered by the acronym TIPS, which stands for threats, interrogation, promises, and surveillance. You cannot threaten to close a facility if a union is formed, nor can you interrogate employees about their personal voting intentions or who attended a union meeting. Promising raises or improved benefits as an incentive to vote against the union is equally prohibited under the law. Surveillance, such as following organizers or spying on employee gatherings, is another major violation that can lead to the NLRB setting aside election results. However, management does have the right to share factual information about the company's financial health or the potential costs of union dues. This right to free speech allows employers to explain their preference for a direct relationship with employees, provided they do not cross into coercive territory. Once a union is certified, the employer and the union enter the phase of collective bargaining to establish a written contract known as a collective bargaining agreement. This process requires both parties to meet at reasonable times and bargain in good faith with the intent of reaching an agreement. The subjects of bargaining are classified into mandatory, permissive, and illegal categories, which dictates what must be discussed. Mandatory subjects include wages, hours of work, and other terms and conditions of employment, such as vacation time and safety rules. Permissive subjects are topics like company internal governance or retiree benefits that neither party is forced to discuss but may choose to. Illegal subjects, such as closed shop provisions or anything that violates federal law, cannot be part of the negotiation at all. The actual negotiation of a labor agreement involves various strategies, often categorized as either distributive or integrative bargaining. Distributive bargaining is a win-lose approach, typically used for economic issues where there is a fixed pie, such as determining hourly wage increases. Integrative bargaining, on the other hand, seeks win-win solutions where both parties collaborate to solve problems, such as redesigning a health plan to keep costs low for the employer while maintaining coverage for the worker. Successful HR professionals often aim for a mix of these strategies to maintain a professional relationship with union leadership. If negotiations stall, a state of impasse may be reached, which can lead to strikes by the union or lockouts by the employer. Understanding these pressures is vital for ensuring the long-term stability of the organization and its labor relations. Finalizing the collective bargaining agreement results in a legally binding document that governs the workplace for a set period, usually 3 to 5 years. This agreement typically includes a grievance procedure, which provides a structured method for resolving disputes over the interpretation of the contract. Most agreements culminate in binding arbitration, where a neutral third party makes a final decision on unresolved grievances. As an HR practitioner, your role transitions from negotiator to administrator once the contract is signed, ensuring that supervisors and managers follow the agreed-upon rules. Failure to adhere to the contract can result in costly grievances and a breakdown in workplace morale. By maintaining the integrity of the agreement, you ensure that the organization operates predictably while respecting the legal rights of the represented employees. See you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. When we discuss the legal landscape of the workplace, the National Labor Relations Act serves as a primary boundary for what is permissible behavior for both employers and labor organizations. An unfair labor practice, or ULP, occurs when an entity violates the rights established by this act, regardless of whether a formal union is already in place. It is common to assume that these rules only apply once a contract is signed, but many violations occur during the delicate period of union organizing campaign. For an HR professional, identifying these behaviors is not merely about staying out of court. It is about maintaining a professional environment where the rights of employees to engage in protected concerted activity are respected. The National Labor Relations Board is the body that investigates these charges, and their reach covers most private sector employers in the United States. Understanding the specific prohibitions for both management and unions is a requirement for anyone seeking the PHR certification. For management, The most frequent violations revolve around interfering with, restraining, or coercing employees as they exercise their right to self-organize or bargain collectively. A classic example of this is the TIPS framework, which outlines things supervisors must not do: threaten, interrogate, promise, or spy. If a manager threatens to close a facility if a union is voted in, they have committed an unfair labor practice because that threat chills the employee's free choice. Similarly, promising a sudden pay raise specifically to discourage union support is considered an unlawful interference with the election process. It is also illegal for management to dominate or interfere with the formation or administration of any labor organization. This means an employer cannot set up a company union that they control, as this undermines the independence of worker representation. Discriminatory actions, such as firing or demoting an employee because they filed a charge with the NLRB, are also strictly prohibited under the law. Labor unions are held to a similar standard under the Taft-Hartley Act, which expanded the definition of ULPs to include actions taken by labor organizations. A union cannot restrain or coerce employees in the exercise of their rights, such as threatening workers who refuse to join a strike or participate in union activities. They are also prohibited from causing an employer to discriminate against an employee, perhaps by demanding the termination of a worker who has spoken out against union leadership. One significant violation for unions is the refusal to bargain in good faith with the employer once they have been certified as the representative. This mirrors the employer's obligation to meet at reasonable times and discuss terms of employment without an all-or-nothing attitude. Additionally, unions are barred from engaging in secondary boycotts, which involves or types of industrial action against a neutral third party to force them to stop doing business with the primary employer. Good faith bargaining is a central concept that often leads to ULP charges if either party behaves in a way that suggests they have no real intention of reaching an agreement. Surface bargaining, where one side merely goes through the motions without presenting substantive counterproposals, is a violation of the duty to bargain. Another common issue is the unilateral change of terms and conditions of employment by the employer while negotiations are ongoing. If a company decides to change the healthcare premium structure without first discussing it with the union, they have bypassed the collective bargaining process and committed a legal error. Information sharing is also a component of this duty. Employers must generally provide relevant data requested by the union for the purpose of bargaining, such as wage scales or safety records. Failing to provide this information in a timely manner is a standard example of a failure to bargain in good faith. To protect the organization, HR must implement rigorous training for supervisors who act as the frontline representatives of management. Supervisors are the most likely individuals to accidentally commit a ULP because they often interact with employees during stressful organizing campaigns. Training should focus on the FOE acronym, which stands for facts, opinions, and experiences, as these are the only safe areas for management communication. A supervisor can state the fact that union dues will be deducted from paychecks, or they can share the opinion that they prefer a direct relationship with employees. However, the moment that opinion turns into a threat, such as suggesting the loss of benefits, the line into an unfair labor practice has been crossed. It is the responsibility of the HR department to ensure that every person in a leadership role understands that their words are legally attributable to the company. I hope this clarified the boundaries of lawful conduct in labor relations. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lecture, we will examine the mechanisms of workplace conflict and the specific professional techniques required to navigate these disputes effectively. Conflict in any organization is an inevitable byproduct of diverse perspectives and competing priorities, but its presence does not inherently signal failure. As an HR professional, you must view conflict as a technical problem to be solved through standardized resolution techniques rather than an emotional crisis to be avoided. The goal is to move from a state of friction to a state of collaboration by identifying the underlying interests of all involved parties. We often see conflict arise due to poor communication, unclear role definitions, or scarce resources, and the method of intervention you choose will determine if the outcome is constructive or destructive. You must remain objective throughout this process, acting as a facilitator who prioritizes the stability of the organization and the legal rights of the employees. Mastery of these techniques ensures that disputes are handled consistently, which mitigates the risk of litigation and maintains a functional corporate culture. Active listening serves as the foundational tool in any mediation or conflict resolution scenario, requiring far more than simply hearing words. To practice active listening effectively, you must provide your full attention, acknowledge the speaker's points without necessarily agreeing with them, and provide feedback that demonstrates comprehension. This involves techniques like paraphrasing what has been said to ensure there is no misalignment in understanding. For example, stating, "What I hear you saying is that the project timeline feels unrealistic given your current staffing levels," allows the employee to either confirm or clarify their position. By eliminating distractions and refraining from interrupting, you create a psychological environment where the parties feel heard, which often de-escalates emotional tension before formal negotiation even begins. This is not merely a soft skill, but a deliberate data-gathering strategy that helps you identify the core issues beneath the surface-level complaints. When moving toward a resolution, you will likely employ various negotiation strategies, ranging from distributive to integrative approaches. In many internal workplace disputes, the goal should be integrative negotiation, often referred to as a win-win strategy, where both parties seek to expand the value of the outcome. This contrasts with distributive negotiation, which is a zero-sum game where one party's gain is explicitly another's loss. To facilitate an integrative outcome, you must encourage the parties to move away from fixed positions and instead focus on their actual interests. For instance, if two managers are fighting over the same budget allocation, the interest might not be the money itself, but rather the successful completion of their respective projects. By identifying these interests, you can often find creative third alternatives, such as shared resources or staggered timelines, that satisfy the requirements of both stakeholders. Mediation is a more structured form of conflict resolution where you, as the HR representative, act as a neutral third party to guide the conversation. Unlike arbitration, where a third party makes a binding decision, mediation empowers the disputing parties to reach their own voluntary agreement. Your role here is to manage the process, not the outcome, ensuring that each person has equal time to speak and that the conversation remains focused on facts rather than personalities. You begin by setting ground rules, followed by a joint meeting where both sides explain their perspective. Afterward, you might hold private caucuses with each individual to explore potential concessions that they might be hesitant to voice in front of the other party. A successful mediation ends with a written agreement that outlines the specific actions each party will take to move forward, providing a clear roadmap for future interactions. While informal mediation is effective for interpersonal friction, more serious disputes or alleged violations of company policy require formalized grievance procedures. A robust grievance procedure provides employees with a transparent and safe avenue to voice concerns without fear of retaliation, which is critical for maintaining labor peace. These procedures usually involve a series of escalating steps, starting with an informal discussion with a supervisor and moving toward a formal written complaint reviewed by higher management or HR. Providing this structure signals to the workforce that the organization values fairness and is willing to hold its own processes accountable. Without these formalized systems, minor issues can quickly escalate into legal claims or unionization efforts, as employees feel they have no internal recourse. For the PHR exam, you should understand that these procedures are not just administrative hurdles, but are essential components of an organization's risk management and employee relations strategy. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back to this final session of the curriculum. As you prepare to sit for the PHR exam, it is important to understand the structural weighting of the domains you have studied. The exam does not distribute questions evenly across all topics, so your final review should prioritize business management and employee and labor relations, as these typically carry the most significant weight. You must be able to demonstrate how HR initiatives align with broader organizational goals and financial outcomes rather than just administrative tasks. Many candidates fail because they view HR in a vacuum, but the PHR demands that you think like a business leader who happens to specialize in people. This means verifying your understanding of how a shift in compensation strategy affects the bottom line and how labor laws impact long-term operational risk. While talent planning and learning and development are critical, they often serve as the tactical execution of the strategic pillars you must master. Ensure you are comfortable with the integrated nature of these domains before you enter the testing center. Test-taking strategy is often as vital as subject matter expertise when facing a standardized exam of this caliber. You should approach each question by first identifying the specific HR domain it belongs to, which helps narrow down the relevant legal frameworks or internal policies. When presented with multiple choice options, look for the answer that provides a proactive, strategic solution rather than a reactive or purely administrative one. HRCI often creates distractors that are technically correct in a narrow sense, but do not represent the best professional practice according to the standards you have learned. If you encounter a scenario-based question, isolate the specific problem the prompt asks you to solve before looking at the choices. Eliminating obviously incorrect answers increases your statistical probability of success, even when you are uncertain about the nuances of a particular federal regulation. Do not let yourself get bogged down by a single difficult question, as managing your time is part of the assessment. The technical environment of the exam also requires a disciplined mindset to avoid fatigue and unnecessary errors. You should practice maintaining a consistent pace that allows for approximately 1 minute per question, leaving a small buffer at the end for reviewing flagged items. However, be cautious about changing your initial answers unless you have found a definitive reason to do so, as your first intuition often relies on the deep-seated knowledge you have built. Ensure you are familiar with the phrasing of questions, particularly those that use qualifiers like most, best, or least, as these words change the entire context of the required response. It is common to feel overwhelmed by the breadth of the material, but remember that the exam is designed to test professional-level judgment across the life cycle of employment. By systematically applying the frameworks of strategic alignment and legal compliance, you can navigate even the most complex scenarios. You have developed the necessary vocabulary and conceptual understanding to handle these requirements through the preceding lessons. I appreciate you joining me for this journey through the HR body of knowledge and wish you the best of luck on your certification exam. See you in your new career as a certified professional.